Chairman Inouye is detained on the floor of the Senate, but we expect he will be here momentarily. And the Senate will have a number of votes throughout the day. Before we start the proceedings, I believe Senator Tribble indicated to me he had a question for House Counsel. Senator Tribble.
Mr. Vice Chairman, I understand in the press that General Secord may have filed an appeal with the Swiss Supreme Court to block the release of bank records yesterday. Is that correct?
Mr. Niels, I believe the question was directed to you.
I'm sorry. I have heard the same thing you have, and I cannot verify it. I have not yet spoken to Mr. Secord's counsel to ask him one way or the other, but I will do so at the noon hour.
Mr. Vice Chairman, if I might say briefly that I believe the proceedings of this, the record of this proceeding should reflect that, according to the press, yesterday General Secord filed a last-minute appeal with the Swiss Supreme Court to block the release of bank records essential to the task of the special counsel and to these committees. The General's actions will inevitably frustrate and delay the pursuit for truth and are totally inconsistent with his words of cooperation in good faith. Unless and until we gain access to those Swiss bank records, we will be unable to determine precisely what happened to those massive amounts of money accumulated in Swiss accounts by General Secord, Mr. Hakim, and Mr. Ghorbanifar. I would note for the record that according to public press accounts, all three have now taken legal action to block our access to those vital records. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Senator Tribble. Good morning, Mrs. Garwood and Mr. O'Boyle and Mr. Coors. Would counsel or various counsel please introduce themselves for the record?
My name is Duncan Osborne. I'm from Austin, Texas.
Deborah Schwartz from New York City.
All right, if the witnesses would please stand, I'll administer the oath. Please raise your right hand. Testimony you're about to give in the course of this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
We did.
You may be seated. Mr. Fryman of the House Committee staff is going to conduct the initial questioning of Mrs. Garwood and Mr. O'Boyle, and then Mr. Kaplan of the Senate Committee will initially question Mr. Coors. It is our understanding that Mrs. Garwood would like the privilege of delivering a short opening statement. Is that correct, Mrs. Garwood?
That's correct.
Well, if you'd pull that microphone up, you may proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, as has been noted in the press, I have given substantial sums for the purpose of assisting the freedom-seeking people of Nicaragua. They are trying to achieve a non-communist alternative in Central America. This in itself is important, and it is of vital importance to the United States of America. This is the third time I have appeared in Washington, D.C. on the subject of aid to the freedom-seeking people of Nicaragua. The first time I came to answer inquiries by the special prosecutor. The next time I appeared before the lawyers of your select investigating committees. Today, I am also here to answer any questions you may have for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any statement to make amongst the witnesses? If not, we will proceed to questioning Mr. Fryman.
Ms. Garwood, would you state your full name for the record, please?
My name is Ellen Garwood, Mrs. St. John Garwood.
And in what city do you reside, Mrs. Garwood?
Austin, Texas.
Are you an author, Mrs. Garwood?
Yes.
What books have you written?
I've written Will Clayton, a short biography, a novel, Come to Me, Megan, and another biography, The Undying Flame, Mariano Moreno of Buenos Aires.
Are you a widow, Mrs. Garwood?
Yes, sir.
Was your husband in public service?
Yes, he was.
What positions did he hold?
He was Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of Texas.
Was your father also in public service?
Yes, sir.
What was his name?
His name is Will Clayton. He was
And-
Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs in the Truman administration in 1945 to 7.
Was he involved in the implementation of the Marshall Plan, Mrs. Garwood?
He was the originator and instigator of the Marshall Plan.
Mrs. Garwood, do you know a gentleman named Carl Channel?
Yes, sir.
When did you first meet Mr. Channel?
I met him first in connection with the National Conservative Political Action Committee, of which Terry Dolan was the head and Carl Channel was an assistant. And this was, I think, around 1980.
Subsequent to that, did Mr. Channel form an organization of his own?
Yes, sir.
And what was the name of that organization?
He had several organizations, and one of them was the American Conservative Trust. I think this was the first. Then he had one called the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty. He had another one called American Anti-Terrorism Committee and Sentinel.
Mrs. Garwood, do you also know a Colonel Oliver North?
Yes, sir.
When did you first meet Mr. North?
I first met Colonel North in May of 1984.
And what were the circumstances of that meeting?
That was a meeting of the Council for National Policy being held in, have you the name of the place? Virginia. It's where we have the colonial restoration.
Was that at Williamsburg?
Williamsburg, yes. Williamsburg, Virginia.
Now, Mrs. Garwood, in April of 1986, or prior to April of 1986, had you made various contributions to Mr. Channel's organization, the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty?
Prior to April, yes, sir.
You had made a number of contributions.
Yes, I had.
Is that organization also called NEPL or NEPL?
Yes, sir.
Now, in April of 1986, did you have an occasion to be in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, sir, I did.
What was the reason that you came to Washington, D.C.?
This was for another meeting of the contributors to Mr. Channel's organization. And it was also, I was understood that I might be able to see the president, that they had made an appointment with me to see the president.
And did Mr. Channel make the arrangements for you to come to Washington?
Yes, he did.
Did you see the president during that visit?
Yes, I did.
All right. What did Mr. Channel tell you in advance of your coming to Washington?
He told me also that I would probably be asked, or I would be asked, for a great deal more, a much larger donation than I had been asked for before, for the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty.
Did he indicate that you would be meeting with anyone else in Washington, apart from himself and the president?
Well, I think it was understood that it would probably be Colonel North.
Now, did you meet with Colonel North after you arrived in Washington?
Yes, sir.
Where did you meet with him?
I met with him at the Hay Adams Hotel in the evening after dinner.
And who else was present?
And Mr. Channel.
Where was that meeting at the Hay Adams?
It was in a sort of corner of a little room adjoining the cocktail room.
Now, when the three of you went into that room, what do you recall that Mr. Channel said and Colonel North said?
Mr. Channel said that there was a crisis in the situation of the freedom-fighting forces in Nicaragua, and then Colonel North appeared and described this crisis.
Now, was there any discussion of any particular needs of the resistance forces in Nicaragua?
He said that they were in such a bad condition that they were out of food, they were out of clothes and medicine, other necessities, and also practically out of weapons.
What was said in that meeting between Mr. Channel and Colonel North about weapons?
The Colonel North had said also that they might cease to exist if something weren't done about these various needs, And then Mr. Channel and Colonel North spoke in low tones to each other, and after they had finished, Mr. Channel produced a list of weapons that they needed.
Could you tell that Mr. Channel and Colonel North were discussing weapons in this lowered voice?
It only seemed that they were after this list appeared.
And did Mr. Channel give you this list?
Yes, he did.
And could you describe the list? What sort of information was on it?
The list had different categories of weapons, had hand grenades, I remember, and bullets, cartridge belts, possibly surface-to-air missiles, and there were quantities opposite each category, and after that there was a sum of money that was needed in order to provide those weapons, that those weapons would cost.
Was there an amount of money for each type of weapon?
Yes, sir.
And was there also a total amount?
I think there was a total amount, yes.
What was the approximate total amount?
The approximate total amount was over $1 million, and I'm not sure just exactly what it was. It was over probably $1.5 million, something like that.
Did Colonel North in this meeting ask you to make a contribution for weapons?
No, Colonel North did not.
Did Mr. Channel ask you to make a contribution?
Mr. Channel did after Colonel North left.
What did he say?
He said, this is the list of things needed, and can you do something about it? Can you help provide for this and some of the other needs that Colonel North had described? And I said, it's a tremendous amount of money. I don't know whether I can afford to do it, whether I'm able to or not. I will have to consult my banker back in Austin.
Did you then return to Austin, Texas?
Yes, sir.
What did you do with the list?
Well, I returned on Sunday afternoon, and on Monday morning, I took the list to Mrs. Ann Glanz, who is the manager of my trust account at the InterFirst Bank in Austin, and asked her and showed her the list, and asked her if it were possible for me to supply the funds needed for that.
And what was her response?
She said, I think you can, but I think we will have to sell some stock. We certainly don't have the cash.
Do you know what Mrs. Glanz did with the list?
Mrs. Glanz, I asked her afterwards for the list, about two or 3 days afterwards, because I left all of the arrangement of the transfer of the stocks and so forth to Mr. Channel. I left all this to her. As you know, my husband was ill, and I wanted Mrs. Glanz to take care of all this. So 2 or 3 days later, I asked her for the list. And she said she had given it to my lawyer, to Mr. Osborne, who is here.
And have you asked Mr. Osborne about the list?
Yes, sir. I immediately called him to get it. And he said that his memory was that he had given it back to Mrs. Glanz.
Mr. Osborne recalls seeing the list, but he did not have the list. Is that correct?
That's right.
And Mrs. Glanz recalls seeing the list. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And has she been able to locate the list?
She has not been able either. She has looked, I have looked, and Mr. Osborne has looked. And it was a very small piece of paper and easily lost.
Now, following the presentation of this list to you by Mr. Channel, did you make a contribution to NEPL in response to Mr. Channel's request?
Yes, sir.
And were those contributions in April and May of 1986?
As I remember, they were.
And were they a combination of wire transfers of cash and contributions of stock?
That's right. That's correct.
Ms. Garwood, would you look at the exhibit book? And particularly exhibit ECG1. Is that a letter that you sent to Mr. Channel notifying him that you had made a wire transfer of $470,000 on or about April 15, 1986?
Yes, sir.
And that also notifies Mr. Channel of the transfer of various shares of stock, does it not?
That's right.
Would you look at Exhibit ECG 2? Is that an acknowledgement that NEPL sent to your lawyer stating that the value of the wire transfer and the stock contribution was $1,633,506?
That's correct, sir.
And would you look at Exhibit ECG 3? Is that a letter that you sent to Mr. Channel on May 19, notifying him of a further wire transfer of $350,000?
Yes, sir.
Now, do those documents reflect the contributions that you made to Mr. Channel's organization in response to his request for a contribution for the items on the list that he gave to you?
That's true.
Thank you, Ms. Garwood. I have a few questions for Mr. O'Boyle. First, Mr. O'Boyle, would you state your full name for the record?
My name is William Buchanan O'Boyle.
And in what city do you reside, Mr. O'Boyle?
I live in New York City.
Would you briefly describe your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree from Stanford University, a master's degree from Columbia University, and a master's degree from New York University.
Are you a private investor, Mr. O'Boyle?
Yes, I am.
Is there any particular area where your investments are centered?
I'm active primarily in the oil and gas business. I own and manage an oil and gas exploration company.
Mr. O'Boyle, in March of 1986, did you receive a telephone call from a representative of NEPL?
Yes, I did.
Who was this representative?
Jane McLaughlin.
And was this in late March 1986?
Yes.
What did Ms. McLaughlin say to you in this telephone call?
She indicated that she'd been given my name by an old friend from Texas, and that she wanted to know if I might be interested in coming down to the White House for a briefing on the political and military situation in Nicaragua.
What was your response?
I told her I was interested.
When did she ask you to come?
The next day.
And did you go?
Yes, I did.
How did you travel to Washington?
I came down on the shuttle.
And you came to National Airport?
Yes.
Did Ms. McLaughlin meet you?
Yes, she did.
How did you travel into Washington?
She met me in a limousine, and we went back to the Hay Adams Hotel in a limousine.
What happened after you arrived at the Hay Adams?
Well, we rendezvoused there with a number of staff members from NEPL and several other people who were possible contributors to NEPL.
Did you meet Mr. Channel at on this occasion?
Yes, we did.
Was that the first time you'd met him?
Yes, it was.
Were there representatives from any other organization at this meeting?
Yes, there were representatives from a group called IBC. I think that's International Business Communications.
Now, on this day, did you meet a Mr. Richard Miller from IBC?
Yes, I did. Later.
Later in that day?
Yes.
How long did this initial meeting at the Hay Adams with Mr. Channel and the others last?
About half an hour, as I recall.
And what happened after this meeting?
The group went over to the old executive office building, went through security at the old executive office building, and we went up to a conference room where we waited for Colonel North to appear.
Approximately how large was the group, Mr. O'Boyle?
About 10 people or so, 10, 12 people, something like that.
And then Colonel North arrived at the conference room?
That's right.
And did he speak to the group?
Yes, he did.
What did he say?
He described the military and political situation in Nicaragua. He had photographs of an airport in Nicaragua that had been recently built. The purpose of the airport was ostensibly commercial, but it was in fact a disguised military airport. One of the uses for which the airport was intended was to recover the Russian backfire bombers after they made a nuclear attack on the United States. Another possible use of this airport was to fly a certain kind of mission that was currently being flown out of Cuba up and down the east coast of the United States. Apparently every day a Russian plane leaves Cuba, as I recall, and goes right up the 12-mile limit, has some kind of a large device on the outside of the plane. We don't know what it is exactly. Our planes follow it right along, come back. This Nicaraguan air base would allow the Russians to fly the same kind of mission up the west coast of the United States. He showed how the harbors in Nicaragua were being enlarged, how the harbors were filled with Eastern Bloc traffic, freighters and so forth from the various Eastern Bloc countries. He described the refugee problem that was happening and that we could expect to happen to an even greater degree as the communists gain a bigger foothold in Central America. Apparently, when the communists take over a country, 10, 20, 30% of the people have to leave the country, and these people are beginning to spill over into Honduras and Guatemala and perhaps Mexico, and we could look forward in the next few years to millions of refugees flooding across our borders as this happened. He indicated how our security services had intercepted the text of a speech which was delivered to the UN by the Nicaraguan representative to the UN, which was complaining about the United States in one respect or another. The point being that it's really the Russians who are managing the diplomacy of the Nicaraguans before the United Nations. He showed photographs which indicated that the Nicaraguan government officials were indicated in smuggling dope, showed pictures of them involved in dope transactions, indicated that the military equipment that was being supplied to Nicaragua by the Cubans and the other Eastern Bloc countries was not merely of a defensive nature, but was the kind of equipment that could be used to expand the communists' control beyond the Nicaraguan borders. He also told an anecdote about some Nicaraguan agents that were recently caught with dope and money and so forth, and disguised as American agents.
Did Colonel North make any request for any contribution from the persons attending this meeting in the conference room?
No.
What happened after the meeting concluded?
We went back to the Hay Adams Hotel.
And was there another reception at the hotel?
Yes, there was.
And who attended this reception?
The people who had been at the briefing. And there may have been one or two other people. I believe Richard Miller at that point was there, and I don't recall seeing him before. There may have been a few other staffers present. I wasn't keeping exact track.
Now, at this reception, did you speak with any of the staffers about any subjects that had been covered at the briefing with Colonel North?
Yes, I did. I indicated that I was concerned and upset about what I'd heard, and I asked if there was any way that we could supply weapons, military equipment to the Contras.
Do you recall who you made this statement to?
I think it was either to Chris Littledale or Cliff Smith, but that's a vague recollection.
It was to an employee of NEPL, you believe?
It was either an NEPL employee or a IBC employee.
What was the response of this person after you made this comment?
Well, the context I made it in was that I'm a wealthy person. I have financial resources. Is there any way I can help? But I don't know even what we're talking about. How much do weapons cost? Can weapons be bought and so forth? And the response came back, well, yes, it's possible that we might be able to do something. For example, a blowpipe missile costs $20,000, and we started talking about the expenses, costs of various types of weapons.
Now, had you intended to spend the evening in Washington on that day?
No.
Did you change your mind at some point?
Yes, I think it was either Ms. McLaughlin or Mr. Channel came up to me at some point after the briefing and said, look, why don't you stay for dinner, spend the night, we've made a reservation for you here at the hotel, and it'll be a lot easier than trying to get back to New York late at night. And I agreed.
And you attended the dinner at the Hay Adams that evening?
Yes.
Now, did you have any discussion with Mr. Channel that evening?
Yes. After dinner, he came over and indicated that he'd heard that I was willing to make an especially large contribution with the idea of possibly supplying weapons or military equipment of some kind to the Contras. He said that there was a small group of people in the United States that the President relied on to make that kind of contribution, that this was a cause that was very dear to the President's heart, and he thought that perhaps I might be interested in joining this group of people.
Did he ask you to attend any further meetings?
Yes, he asked me to stay or to come to breakfast the next morning with himself and Colonel North.
And did you attend such a breakfast?
Yes, I did.
Did you have a meeting with Mr. Channel before Colonel North arrived?
Yes. It wasn't exactly a meeting. Mr. Channel arrived first, and we rendezvoused there and waited for Colonel North to arrive.
What did Mr. Channel say to you in this preliminary encounter?
Well, it was either in this preliminary encounter or it may have been the evening before. I don't quite remember the exact point, but he said that if one were to give money up to a certain point, if one were to give approximately $300,000 or more, the President would actually meet with the contributor and thank him personally, spend 15 or so minutes with him on an off-the-record kind of meeting, and thank him for the contribution he was making to the national security.
Did he comment again about this small group that he had described the night before that were making contributions for weapons?
Well, throughout our discussions over the few days we're talking about, he did mention the group several times.
Did he indicate that between his first conversation with you and the conversation that morning that there had been any sort of inquiry as to your background and your qualifications for being in this group?
Yes. He indicated the next morning that he had checked me out overnight. And I assumed that he meant that he had access to some kind of national security computer service that checked me out.
Did he also comment about records of your stay at the Hay Adams Hotel?
Yes, he did. He indicated that there would be no record of my stay there.
Did he comment about the record of any meeting of the sort that he described with President Reagan?
Yes, as I recall, he indicated that those meetings were unrecorded, off-the-record meetings.
Now, did Colonel North arrive at some point and join you at the Hay Adams that morning?
Yes, he did.
And did the three of you have breakfast together?
Yes, we did.
What did Mr. Channel say after Colonel North arrived?
Well, he introduced me as someone who was willing to provide money for weapons. I don't recall his exact words, but that was in effect what he said.
What did Colonel North say in response to this?
Well, Colonel North made the point that he could not ask for money himself as a government employee, but that he could provide information, and he did that. He began to explain the type of weapons which were needed.
Did he have any sort of paper with him as he was describing these types of weapons?
As I recall, he had a small notebook which he referred to.
What types of weapons did he indicate were needed?
Well, he talked about blowpipe missiles, which were $20,000 apiece, but which had to be purchased in packs of 10. These were necessary to counteract the Hind helicopter gunships which the Russians had been supplying to the Sandinistas and were wreaking havoc upon the Contras. We also talked about Stinger missiles. He described the ammunition needs, referred to a type of NATO ammunition. He referred to a type of Eastern Bloc ammunition that was being used by the Contras that they needed. He gave prices for those. And he also described a certain kind of aircraft that was needed.
What type of aircraft was that?
It was a Maul aircraft.
Is that a brand of aircraft?
Yes, the Maul is the manufacturer of the aircraft.
That's spelled M-A-U-L-E?
Yes.
Now, what did he indicate was the need for the Maul aircraft?
Well, apparently these Maul aircraft were used to supply for two reasons. One was to fly supply missions which would deliver supplies to the Contras. These are light aircraft, easily repaired, relatively easy to fly, and can carry a heavy load, so they could, and short takeoff and landing, so they can dump supplies out to the Contras. And also they had apparently some kind of very sophisticated surveillance and communications gear on board. And as they flew up and down the borders or wherever they flew, they could report back to Washington what was going on.
And he identified the Maul aircraft as one of the types of weapons that were needed by the Contras. Is that correct?
Well, I don't want to quibble with you about the word weapons, but it was on the list. It was on that list.
It was one of the items that was given to you in response to Mr. Channell's comment that you wanted to make a contribution for weapons.
That's right.
Was there a price identified for these planes?
Yes, they were quoted at $65,000 each. Apparently that was a reduced price.
Now, you say while Colonel North was there, he stated that he could not himself ask for a contribution?
That's right.
What happened after he left?
Well, Mr. Channell and I talked a bit more, pretty much about what we'd been talking about all along, and I indicated that I'd be willing to think this over, and that I'd get back to Mr. Channell if I decided I wanted to contribute.
In the breakfast meeting with Colonel North, was there any further discussion about a meeting with President Reagan with contributors?
Not as far as I recall, no.
What decision did you make about making a contribution?
I decided that I would make a contribution.
And what amount did you decide to contribute?
I decided to contribute $130,000.
And what was this to be for?
2 of the Maul aircraft.
How did you make this contribution?
I hand-delivered the check to Mr. Channell in Washington a few days later.
Did you have a further meeting with Mr. Channell?
When I delivered the check, you
Yes.
mean? Yes, I did.
Did you have a further meeting with Colonel North?
Yes.
How did that come about?
I brought the check to Washington and went directly over to the NEPL headquarters, where I was taken to the Hay Adams by Miss McLaughlin. And I met Mr. Channell there at the Hay Adams. I had the check in my pocket. After Miss McLaughlin had left, I gave Mr. Channell the check. And I said, I've decided to contribute, and this is for 2 of the Maul aircraft.
And did he say anything about getting in touch with Colonel North?
Well, yes. Well, then he went out. As I recall, he went and called Colonel North, who then came over.
And joined you at the Hay Adams?
Yes.
And what did Mr. Channel say to Colonel North after he arrived?
Well, he showed him the check, and he indicated that I'd made a contribution, and that's what he said.
And what was Colonel North's response?
He acknowledged that I'd made the contribution.
Was there any further discussion of weapons on this occasion?
Yes, Colonel North had essentially the same list that we went over again, and ammunition. I think that he indicated that the source of the blowpipe missiles had decided not to sell to Colonel North's group for one reason or another, so those were no longer available.
And there was a review of the other types of weapons.
Yes,
again at
he
this
reviewed
meeting.
the Eastern Bloc ammunition that was required. Essentially the same list as before.
Did Mr. Channel make any comment on this occasion about contributors meeting with the President?
Yes. He indicated that I might want to meet with the President, and that if I were willing to give more money or to commit to becoming a fundraiser, it wasn't quite clear exactly what the exact conditions were, but if I were to increase and continue my commitment to this effort that was going on, that I would meet with the President.
Was there an amount specified by Mr. Channel?
Around $300,000. If I were to give approximately that much, that I would meet with the President.
Was there any response by Colonel North to this comment by Mr. Channel?
No particular response.
What decision did you make, Mr. O'Boyle, about making further contributions?
I decided not to make any further contributions.
And did you notify Mr. Channel of this decision?
Yes,
How did you notify him?
by mailgram.
So the only contribution to this point that you had made, and to the point that you announced you were not going to make any further contributions, was the $130,000 for the 2 Maul airplanes.
That's right.
Is that correct? And would you look at Exhibit WBO-1? Is that the check that you gave to Nepal for the planes?
Yes, it is.
After you sent the mailgram to Mr. Channel that you have described, did you hear further from him?
Yes, I did.
What did he say to you?
Either he or someone from his office called my office in New York and asked for a luncheon appointment, which I agreed to.
And did you have lunch with him later in New York?
Yes, I did.
And was that within a few weeks of your earlier meeting?
Yes.
Who attended this luncheon?
It was Mr. Channel and Mr. Conrad.
Who is Mr. Conrad?
An associate of Mr. Channel's. I think he was his second in command at the Nepal.
What did Mr. Channel say to you during this luncheon?
Well, he indicated that I had given my contribution so quickly that they hadn't had the chance to give me all of the sort of courtesies and show me all the presentations and so forth that they wanted to, and they asked if I would come down to Washington to have another meeting with Colonel North.
And did you agree to do that?
Yes.
And did you come down and have a further meeting?
Yes, I did.
Where was that meeting?
That was at Colonel North's office in the old executive office building.
And approximately when was that meeting?
I think it was the 29th of April.
About how long did you meet with Colonel North on this occasion?
It was half an hour to 45 minutes.
Was anyone else present?
Mr. Channel was present at the initial part of the meeting.
And then you met alone with Colonel North?
Yes.
And at this meeting, did he generally describe the administration's strategy in Nicaragua?
Yes.
Was there any further discussion of weapons needs in this meeting?
No. Other than in the first part of the meeting, I think Nepal was involved in a humanitarian aid program that we talked about a little bit, which involved supplying boots and uniforms, that sort of thing, to the Nicaraguans, to the Contras.
But there was a general discussion of the strategy with respect to that country. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
And did Colonel North ask you for any contribution during that meeting?
No.
Now, did you meet with Mr. Channel after the meeting?
As I recall, yes.
Was there any discussion of further contributions with Mr. Channel?
Well, I had already indicated that I didn't want to give further contributions, and so the way we left it was that he would, or that if I wanted to give anything more, I would be in touch with him.
And did you get back in touch with him?
No.
Did you make any further contributions?
Yes, I did.
When did you make a further contribution?
It was later that year. Let's see, I don't recall the exact date. I think it was September 30th.
And how much was that contribution?
$30,000.
Was that in response to a specific request from Mr. Channel?
Yes, it was.
What was the nature of that request?
The nature of the request was that even though Congress had authorized further payments to the Nicaraguans, the money was taking a long time to trickle down to the point where it could be used, and that they were still in very desperate shape, and that this would be the final request that Nepal would be making on behalf of the Contras.
Mr. O'Boyle, what had been indicated to you by Nepal with respect to the tax deductibility of your contribution?
Well, early on, I had been given to believe that Nepal was a tax deductible organization, as they say, that contributions would be tax deductible.
How was that communicated to you?
In the standard package of materials that they sent out.
Did you take a tax deduction on your 1986 return for the $130,000 contribution that you made?
My return is still unfiled. It's on extension.
Ms. Garwood, let me ask you a few other questions on the same subject with respect to the tax treatment of your contribution. Did you take a deduction on your 1986 return for the contributions that you've described earlier?
I left that up to my tax assessor, and they did take a tax deduction. And then I had later on a call from Spitz Channel, in which he said, this was after the Iran-Contra affair had been aired, and he said that, I said to him, you know, Mrs. Glanz is worried about the fact that you told her to send the money for the weapons through the organization of NEPL, because that she is wondering whether that is a tax-deductible donation or not. And NEPL is supposed to be tax-deductible. And I said, why did you do that? Is that true that you can put this money through an organization that is tax deductible. I had not paid much attention to it, as I say, because I was nursing a very ill husband at the same time. And he said, Mrs. Garwood, I have talked to Colonel North since this happened, and he told me that since you were able to supply, he said, you remember in the conversation that he spoke of a good many other needs, humanitarian needs, how they were foraging for food and they would be accused falsely by the leftists of drug smuggling in order to get money to clothe themselves and for medicine and for food and other things. He said they needed those other things too. And Colonel North told me that your money could go for that and that because you were relieving them of the need to get this amount, otherwise they could use that, they would have that extra money for the weapons. So the weapons were handled in another way.
And when was this conversation with Mr. Channel?
This was in December of 1986.
So it's your understanding that on your tax return as filed for 1986, a deduction was taken for the contributions?
It was first taken, and then I talked to my tax assessor about it and asked him to talk to my counsel, Mr. Osborne, and I will leave the rest of this to him because I left it to them, what to do. And he can respond to that better than I can.
Mr. Osborne, is it your understanding that there was an amended return filed after the original return?
That's correct. Excuse me, that's correct. An amended return was filed.
And was the deduction taken on the amended return?
No, it was not.
What happened between the filing of the original return and the amended return?
Yeah.
We had a meeting on April 13th, 2 days before the return was due, to decide how to handle this matter. We had knowledge of Mrs. Garwood's conversation with Mr. Channel, in which she just described. During the rest of the time interval between that conversation and April 13th, I had made efforts to get more detailed information from Mr. Channel and from his attorneys without success. We further, on April 13th, contacted the Internal Revenue Service in Washington, D.C., Mr. Larry Batdorf, who confirmed that the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty had been tax exempt throughout all of 1986 and was still tax exempt. Based on that information, we filed a return and claimed the deduction. About 2 weeks later, around April 30th, Mr. Channel pled guilty, which made the conversation that he had with Mrs. Garwood highly suspect. And on the basis of that new information, we amended the return and did not claim the deduction.
May I say something too? In making donations to the various needs of the freedom-seeking people of Nicaragua, it never made any difference to me. I never did it because it was tax deductible. I would have done it whether it was or whether it was not.
Mrs. Garwood, in your various meetings with Colonel North, did he ever indicate that he was sharing with you or showing you any sort of classified information?
No, sir.
Mr. O'Boyle, in your meetings with Colonel North, did he ever indicate that he was sharing any classified information with you?
Yes, he did.
On what occasion?
It was the second meeting that I went to down in Washington, where he described the administration's strategy in Nicaragua.
That was the meeting in his office, not the meeting at the hotel. Is that
That's
correct?
right, in his office.
Thank you, Mr. O'Boyle. Thank you, Mrs. Garwood. Mr. Coors, my colleague, Mr. Kaplan, has some questions for you.
Mr. Kaplan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Coors. Mr. Coors, your full name is Joseph Coors, is that correct? And you reside in Golden, Colorado?
Correct.
Are you currently Vice Chairman and a Director of the Adolph Coors Company?
Yes, I am.
And approximately how long have you held these positions?
I've held those positions since May of 1985.
And were you that company's president from 1977 to 1985?
Yes, I was.
And did you also serve as chief
Chief Operating Officer, yes.
Okay. I'm going to give you an opportunity to attract a large gathering at the lunch recess today. What is the nature of your company's business?
Well, the major business of the Adolph Coors Company is the manufacture and distribution and sale of beer. We do have a number of subsidiaries, however, including the largest industrial ceramic operation in the United States.
Thank you. In the late spring or early summer of 1985, Mr. Coors, did you initiate a meeting with William Casey?
Yes, I did.
And what was the purpose of that meeting?
Well, I had been observing the situation in Nicaragua for some time, beginning at the time of their elections when Ortega was elected, and I had been observing how the progress of that country had gone away from a democratic form of government, the slow but steady oppression of the people by taking away their freedom of the press, their freedom of religion, their freedom of speech, and eventually their freedom of elections. There are no possibilities of a free election in Nicaragua today, as I think you all know. And during the course of that, and during the time previous to, say, June of '85, when I met with Mr. Casey, I had heard and talked with a good number of people in regard to the plight of the Nicaraguan freedom fighters, the fact that they needed clothes, they needed medical supplies, they needed food, and I just made up my mind I wanted to try to do something about that if I could. And Bill Casey was a good friend of mine. I had worked with him since '79 when he and Ed Meese were ahead of the Reagan-Bush campaign. I had worked quite closely with both of them and many others on that campaign. And I just had a full feeling of trust of Bill. I knew that he was certainly as familiar as anybody else as the problems in the international scene. And so I just made up my mind that I wanted to talk to him and to ask his advice.
Is it fair to say that the principal purpose of that meeting was for you to express to Casey your interest in providing monetary support for the freedom fighters in Nicaragua?
Well, the purpose was to ask him what he felt I might be able to do to help the freedom fighters.
And when did a meeting with Mr. Casey take place?
Well, your records that you showed me yesterday indicated it was on June 18th.
That's correct.
Late in the afternoon.
And do you recall where the meeting took place?
The meeting took place in his office, not the one, the CIA headquarters, but an office he had in the Washington area. I believe it was in the EEOB.
Okay. And was anyone else present at that meeting, Mr.
No,
Coors?
there was no one else was present.
Okay. Did you tell Casey that you were interested in providing monetary support for the freedom fighters?
Yes, I did.
And what was his response to your expressed interest?
Well, his response is that he couldn't do anything for me along those lines, but that he knew a person that a mutual person that we knew that could help me, and that was Colonel Oliver North.
And did he tell you why he couldn't do anything along those lines?
No, he didn't.
That is Mr. Casey.
He just made point blank. He said, Ollie North's the guy to see.
So it's fair to say he was pretty guarded or circumspect about it.
I think, yes, I think that's fair to say.
Okay. And did you arrange a meeting with Colonel North?
I didn't. He did.
Can you tell me how that meeting was arranged?
He had, I believe he had one of his assistants there call North's office to see if North was there and available, and he turned out he was, so I went down to his office.
So you met with North later that day?
Yes, right after my meeting with Casey.
And that meeting took place in North's office in the old executive office building?
OEOB, correct.
Was anyone else present at that meeting?
No, no one else was there.
And did you also express to North your interest in providing monetary support for the freedom fighters?
Yes, I told him that I was interested in seeing what I could do, and I asked him for his recommendations.
And I take it in response, Colonel North was not quite as guarded or as circumspect as Mr. Casey had been.
No, he was very anxious to provide me with an area where he thought I could be of most help.
And what was that area?
That was in the area of providing a small Mall airplane. I was a little bit surprised to see that Bill O'Boyle also bought. I thought I was the first and only one, but evidently that wasn't the case. In any case, he told me that they needed this kind of an airplane in the worst way down there. The only plane that the freedom fighters had down in Nicaragua at that time was an old, dilapidated DC-3 that they had a hard time keeping in the air because of lack of spare parts and so forth. And he said one of these small planes, which are rather remarkable things, I don't know if any of you are flyers, but if you're familiar with a Piper Cub, it's probably as tiny as the tiniest Piper Cub. It has special capabilities of very short landing and takeoff, which was mentioned before. And this was important because they could get into these various bases in the Nicaraguan area, the various bases where the freedom fighters were stationed.
Did North show you any material relating to Mall airplanes?
Yes, he showed me a Mall Air Inc. brochure, and specifically showed me the model and the plane that he would like to have me provide funds for.
And did he quote you a price?
Yes, he said there was one of those planes was available at the Mall Company, and that it could be procured with all spare parts and special instrumentation for $65,000.
So at least we know there's some equilibrium in the market.
It looks like we were both quoted the same price.
Did he tell you how you can make a payment to purchase a Mall plane for the freedom fighters?
Yes, he indicated I could do that in any of a number of ways, but he suggested the possibility of a bank transfer to a Swiss bank account, and I chose that route.
And did North, subsequent to the meeting, provide you the Swiss bank account name and number to which your payment should be made?
Yes, he did.
Is Exhibit JC2 a copy of the document transmitted to you by North containing that information?
Yes, to the best of my knowledge, that is a copy of it. I wondered then, and I still wonder why he crossed out AG 195, so forth. I don't know what the significance of that is. But
okay. Could you please read aloud the information that's contained on that slip of paper?
It's just a plain piece of paper. It says Lake Resources, Inc., account number 386-430-22-1, Credit Suisse Bank. Well, I'm not good at French, but it's Vives Branch. My wife will get a kick out of that because she knows I don't know. I'm not a linguist. Geneva, Switzerland. Attention, Mr. Jacob Steger.
And is there also a telex number on that
Telex
slip?
22805.
Thank you, Mr. Kors. Did you arrange in August of 1985 to make a payment of $65,000 to the Lake Resources account in Switzerland?
I did.
And does Exhibit JC1 reflect your instructions to your bank in Colorado to make that payment?
Yes, that is a letter I wrote to Mr. Grant, the president of the Colorado National Bank in Denver, which is the bank where I have my major checking account. And it just says, confirming our telephone conversation this morning, please transfer $65,000 out of Joseph and Holly Coors' personal account at Colorado National Bank to the following. And the following was what I read off the other exhibit.
Right. Did you have occasion to discuss this payment with North sometime after it was made?
I am sure I let him know that I had made that transfer, but I'm not clear. It certainly wasn't a personal visit with him, probably by telephone.
What did North tell you about the use of the funds?
Well, when I talked to him, I was assured by him that this would be used for the purchase of this plane. I had made it quite clear to him that I didn't want to get involved in any military assistance to the freedom fighters, that I wanted to do it on a humanitarian, non-military basis, and he indicated that this plane would fit into that pattern, and so we went ahead on that basis. And I feel very confident that the monies were used for that purpose. He told me they were. I trust him.
And Mr. Coors, you told us yesterday that you do not know a Carl R. Channel.
Yes, I did testify that. And Mrs. Garwood said something just this morning that sort of piqued my interest. She said he had been an assistant or a co-worker with Terry Dolan. I did know Terry Dolan, and it's quite possible that through Terry I might have met and shook hands with Channel. I don't have any recollection of it. I meet dozens of people at some of these meetings, and my memory isn't good enough to remember them all.
Do you recall ever having been solicited by him to contribute funds to any one of his organizations?
I was never solicited, to the best of my knowledge, by Mr. Channel.
And have you ever made any donations to the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty?
I have not.
Well, Mr. Coors, thank you very much. You've been very cooperative, and I appreciate it. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Van Cleve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Garwood, you may recall that I'm George Van Cleve. We met during your deposition not too long ago. And Mr. Coors, Mr. O'Boyle, we have not previously met, but just for purposes of identification, I'm the minority counsel for the House. I have only a few brief questions for a couple of you here today, and I'll try not to take too long, but there are a couple of topics that I did want to go over, particularly with you, Mrs. Garwood. Ms. Garwood, you may remember that during your deposition, you were asked about a briefing that you attended at the White House in January of 1986. And you were asked to describe the nature of the presentations that were made at that briefing. And my recollection is that you told us that Colonel North made a presentation, and that at the end of the various presentations, the President himself spoke to you and some other people who attended that briefing. I wonder if you could briefly just tell the committee the nature of the presentations that were made to you during that briefing. Just try and describe for the committee what was said.
Well, Colonel North made a presentation. Also, Mr. Elliott Abrams made a presentation, and then the President. The topic of all of these presentations was the danger to the United States if another Cuba should be established in our hemisphere, which should be obvious to everybody. But this was gone into, and how far the Nicaraguans had gone along that path, the Nicaraguan government.
Right. Now, you knew when you went to that briefing, didn't you, that the president had been trying to get assistance for the Contras? You already knew that when you went there, that the president...
Oh, yes, because he, on television several times he said that he wanted, until Congress should vote the money needed, that he wanted humanitarian aid to be given by private people.
Right, and so there was no question about that in your mind. There was no secret about it.
Not at all.
Okay, and can you tell us what else the president said during the briefing?
I think he thanked us all for having been willing to take this matter to our hearts and try to do something about it. And he's always very eloquent, and this was the gist of what he said.
And I appreciate that. And I think you were asked during your deposition whether there was any discussion of the military requirements of the Contras during that briefing. And my recollection is that you told us there was not. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. The next subject that I wanted to ask you about has to do with the events after the meeting that you had with Carl Channel in April 1986, where you were given a list of weapons and asked if you could help to purchase them. As I understand it, you took that list back to Austin with you.
Yes.
And you gave it to your banker, Mrs. Glanz. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. And she is the trustee of your trust account. Is that correct?
Yes, she's the manager.
She's the manager of your trust account. Okay. And as I understand it, she then took the list to your attorney, Mr. Osborne. Is that correct?
She did at some time. I don't know whether she did right away or not.
I see. But within a few days, would that be accurate?
Within a few days, yeah.
Okay. And he is your attorney. Is that correct?
That's right.
And he's also the attorney for the bank, I believe?
He's the attorney for my trust arrangement with the bank.
Okay. Now, did either Mr. Osborne or Mrs. Glanz tell you that you couldn't buy weapons for the Contras because it would be against the law to do so?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. And to your knowledge, it's perfectly legal to use private money to do that, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. The question of whether you can take a tax deduction is an entirely separate matter, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
Right, and it was, as I understood your earlier testimony today, you intended to give the money without regard to the question of whether you could get a tax deduction.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. The last subject that I wanted to ask you about, Mrs. Garwood, had to do with the Oliver North Legal Defense Fund. And I wondered if you could tell the committee, please, the story concerning your contribution to that legal defense fund. As I understand it, it starts out in early December 1986 when you talked to Spitz Channel about the possibility of making such a contribution. Could you please tell the committee that story and take it from there?
Yes. Mr. Channel said over the phone that that Colonel North had been had resigned or had been fired from the government. I really didn't understand which. I thought he had resigned, but he was in a position where he was going to need perhaps legal defense, and he also needed, Mr. Channel said, some money. He would like to have some funds for educating his children. From then, oh yes, and then he said, will you send a certain amount to help him out? And I said, yes, I think I can. He said, can you send $10,000? And I said, well, I can't send that all from my account right now because I don't have enough to do it. And I will ask my husband if he will let me send for his account $5,000 and for my account $5,000, and that will make the $10,000. And so that's what I did.
Now, did there come a time shortly after that when you got a phone call from Andy Messing about that same subject? And can you tell the committee what you said?
He asked me to give a donation for the North Legal Defense Fund, and I said, well, I've already given to Mr. Channel. And he said, do you know that Mr. Channel takes 35% for his own organizations, for his overhead, and so on? And I said, no, I do not. And I said...
Ms. Garwood, your microphone is a little bit far away. I want to
Oh.
make sure the committee heard that.
Yes.
He told you that Mr. Channel was keeping 35% of the contributions to his organization?
He told me that that's what he had heard, that Channel was taking 35% of donations given to his organizations for his own overhead and expenses, and that this was a very high amount. And of course, I thought it was too. So I
you
said,
didn't know
well,
anything about that previously,
I didn't know
did you?
anything about that, and perhaps I should have inquired more, but I didn't. At any rate, I said, you are raising an official, he's a Marine, Andy Messing, and a friend of Colonel North. You are raising an official Marine-backed legal fund to defend Colonel North. And he said he was, and he explained that to me, and I said, well, I shall ask Mr. Channel to send back what I sent to him, and I will send, made out to the North Legal Defense Fund, a check for $10,000 to you as soon as I get my donation back.
Right. And did you then call Mr. Channel to obtain a refund
Yes, I
of your
did.
contribution? And can you tell us about that conversation, please?
Well, he was disappointed. I told him that I had heard that he was taking 35% of donations for his overhead, and I thought that was rather large, and I thought he should have told me that. And he said, where did you hear this? And I told him that Andy Messing had told me. And he said, well, I think we conservatives should all cooperate with each other. I'm very surprised that he would tell you that, and so on.
Did he
And
deny that he was doing that, Ms.
he
Garland?
didn't actually deny it, as I remember. But he did consent to send the $10,000 back to me, and I said, I prefer to make it out to an official North Legal Defense Fund, and if you will please send the money back, and he did.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Garwood. I have no further questions of you at this time. Mr. O'Boyle, I have just a couple of questions. If you'll give me just a moment here to get organized, I'd appreciate it. Mr. O'Boyle, I believe that you testified at your deposition that you attended a briefing at the White House on March 27, 1986, and you've described today a series of meetings connected with that briefing. I have a couple of questions about the circumstances surrounding that briefing for you. I understand that when you arrived at the National Airport, you were met by a limousine, is that correct?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, that limousine was either rented or owned by the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty, is that correct?
Yes.
Did it surprise you that you were being met by a limousine that was either chartered or owned by a tax-exempt organization?
It did a little bit, yes.
I understand that during that day or day and a half period, you attended a cocktail party, a dinner, you stayed overnight at the Hay Adams, you had breakfast there. Can you tell us who paid for that?
I don't know. Mr. Channel indicated that it was taken care of. I assumed it was NEPO.
And have you ever stayed at the Hay Adams yourself, sir? And paid the bill yourself on occasion?
Yes, I
You're
have.
aware then that it's a very expensive hotel, are you not?
Yes.
Did it surprise you that a tax-exempt organization was putting you up at one of the most expensive hotels in Washington?
Well, not really, because I was potentially a very large contributor, so I thought perhaps they were spending a little to get a lot.
I see. Okay. All right. Fair enough. Have you ever visited Mr. Channel's offices here in Washington, sir?
Yes.
And do you know where they were located up until about December 1986?
I've been there. I can't remember the address.
If I told you they were downtown in the heart of the business district, would it surprise you to learn that?
Well, I remember a townhouse somewhere in downtown
Well, then I
Washington.
take it you haven't been to the offices that Mr. Channel occupied until about December 1986, which were located right downtown in a rather large office building. Is that correct?
That would surprise me.
Would it surprise you to learn that Mr. Channel paid more than $20,000 a month rent for those offices?
I don't know about Mr. Channel's other activities.
Okay,
so
I take it that you really aren't in a position to tell the committee about how Mr. Channel handled the finances of his organization. Is that correct? As a contributor, though, to a tax-exempt entity which is raising supposedly desperately needed funds, for the Nicaraguan Contras, would it surprise you to learn that that organization had rented very expensive downtown Washington offices, was allowing its manager to drive around in a stretched limousine? Would that sort of thing surprise you? If you were giving funds to a tax-exempt entity, would you want them to conduct business that way?
I can't really comment on Mr. Channel's business practices. I don't know what they are.
Well, I realize that you're not familiar with the circumstances, but just as a former contributor, would you have wished that your money had been spent a little bit differently? I guess that's what I'm asking you.
I felt that some of the limousines and good hotels and so forth were provided in an attempt to raise money, and that is done by organizations to raise money.
Understand. Okay. You heard Mrs. Garwood testify this morning that there are some indication that Spitz Channel kept 35% of the contributions to his organization as overhead. Were you ever told that 35% of your contributions would be kept as overhead?
No.
Would that come as a surprise to you to learn that that might have happened?
Yes, it would.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of additional questions, again, on the circumstances surrounding the meetings that you had down here in Washington. In connection with your interest in helping the Contras, did Colonel North tell you that he had been involved in the arrest of a major drug dealer who was carrying millions of dollars in a suitcase or in the trunk of a car?
He told me that he was somehow involved or knew about or was present at some event like that.
Okay. And did he also tell you that he believed that the KGB was taking active measures to prevent him from helping the Contras?
Yes.
Could you tell the committee a little bit more about what he said to you on that subject?
Well, he said that the KGB, I indicated to him that I was concerned, about this kind of activity, being a civilian, not having any government protection. I mean, obviously, you're playing in a or driving in the fast lane when you're doing this sort of thing, and I felt that that was one reason why I didn't want to continue myself, and I indicated to Colonel North. Colonel North, if I were you, I'd be concerned about that too. I should think the KGB would be highly interested in preventing you from doing what you're trying to do here. And he said, yes, as a matter of fact. And we talked a little bit about how various press people were trying to get his picture in the paper, and he was trying to keep his picture out of the paper. And newspaper articles were being leaked and so forth. And he indicated that perhaps, or he suspected that perhaps some of those activities were motivated by the KGB. And that there is a technique called active measures on the part of the KGB where they try to discredit government officials who are doing them harm.
Did Colonel North, again in connection with your interest in helping the Contras, tell you of a secret plan to allow the Contras to take power in Nicaragua?
Yes.
And can you describe that for the committee, please?
Well, you understand, of course, Colonel North indicated to me that that was a secret.
I understand that he indicated to you that it was secret, and without disclosing any of the specifics, would you describe in general terms the plan? The committee does not need to have the specifics, but just describe to us, please, in general terms, the nature of the plan.
Well, the plan itself I took to be secret. The general, specific or general.
I see. So you took it that he was disclosing to you classified information that should not be revealed to the public? Do I understand you correctly?
Yes.
Well, on the basis of that representation, I won't pursue the matter, but he did describe this plan to you in detail. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Just one final question. Did Mr. Channel ever tell you that Bunker Hunt had donated something on the order of $1 million to help the Contras?
I think so, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions of these witnesses. Thank you.
Mr. Rugino.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Morning, and Mrs. Garwood. Mrs. Garwood, I know that Mr. Fryman and others have gone over some of these questions, and probably I may plow the same ground, but please bear with me. It's in an effort to try to get and shed some more light on the subject. You testified about your contributions to the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty in April and May 1986 following a meeting with Mr. Channel and Colonel North, did you not?
Yes, sir.
Had you participated in prior meetings with both Colonel North and Mr. Channel?
Yes, sir.
Was one of those meetings with Colonel North at his office in the old Executive Office building in August of about 1985?
I believe it was in the summer of 1985. I'm not sure it was August.
Well, sometime there, about late
sometime.
1985.
Yes.
Colonel North say anything to you at that meeting?
Trying to remember. It seems to me that this was the second meeting. I had met him at Williamsburg, Virginia, yes. And the second meeting, he was showing me a map of Nicaragua and of Central America and discussing the chances of the freedom-seeking forces there to invade and go forward with their purpose.
Well, did he ask you, Ms. Garwood, about any contribution?
No, sir.
Did Mr. Channel ask for a contribution?
I think he did after we left the office.
Did he specify any amount?
He always specified the amount, yes, sir.
What was the amount?
Well, I have down here that there was a check for $15,000 during the summer and one for $75,000.
Did you give him those specific amounts?
Yes, sir.
When and where was your next meeting with Mr. Channel and Colonel North?
The next meeting was in Dallas in September of
Was that at an airport?
At the airport, yes.
Was that when Mr. Calero was also there?
Yes, sir.
Colonel North have anything to say to you at that time?
He described the fact that the supplies that were being sent to the freedom fighting forces were not getting to them, and that there was some mix-up or tangle where there was no transport to take them across the border from Honduras to their camps.
Did he say anything about wanting a contribution?
Say anything about what, sir?
Contribution?
He never mentioned a contribution to me. Never said. He always said, "I'm not asking you for money. I can't. I'm not supposed to."
How about Mr. Channel?
After we left the meeting, Mr. Channel.
In other words, Mr. North would not talk about a contribution, but following that, Mr. Channel would talk with you and ask for a contribution.
That's it. Yes, sir.
And what kind of a contribution did Mr. Channel then ask for?
Then he asked me for a contribution for this transport, for trucks and boats and things to take the materials that were being sent.
Was that for
supposedly humanitarian aid?
Was that for a specific amount?
That was a specific amount, yes, sir.
And what was that amount?
$32,000.
And how much did you give him?
I gave him that.
You mentioned that you did attend a White House briefing, and I think that was sometime in January 1986, which was organized by Mr. North, where Colonel North spoke about the situation in Nicaragua, and there were others, and of course you testified that, I think that was the time Mr. Abrams was there, and the President also spoke.
Yes, sir.
And you testify that, to the best of your recollection, there's never any mention at that time about funds.
No. There was no mention of funds, except to thank the people who were gathered there for the contributions they had been making for humanitarian aid. There was, I'm sure,
and that was specified?
I can't remember that was said exactly, but the tenor of the gratitude was for what we had been doing with trying to help and respond to the President's televised requests, public requests for humanitarian aid. Yes, sir.
Did Colonel North or any of the other officials ask you for any contributions there?
Not at the meeting, no.
They did not.
Oh, no, Colonel North never did.
But how about Mr. Channel? Did he ask you then?
Yes.
And did he specify any amount at that time?
He did, and it was around $65,000. Yes, sir.
How much was the amount?
$65,000.
Thank you. You had another meeting, I think your next meeting was with Colonel North and Mr. Channel, and that was the meeting in April 1986, and you described that in your direct testimony, and that's the meeting, I think, which resulted in your contributing some $2 million. Is that not correct?
Yes, sir.
Is that the meeting where the weapons list, after the weapons list had been shown you?
That's right.
And you gave that money knowing that you were going to provide $2 million or whatever it was, $2.5 million for the purchase of weapons as well.
Yes, for the purchase of weapons and probably also for some humanitarian aid, which they needed and which had been described at that meeting.
Mrs. Garwood, in your deposition on page 26, you said that officials at the White House briefings were never, in quote, these are your words, that blunt in requesting funds. You also went on to say, and this is on page 101 of your deposition, that Colonel North's involvement, and I'm quoting your words in the deposition, seemed to me a guarantee that this was the executive department of the government that was asking for this help. Are those your words?
Yes.
As best you recollect?
They are my words. That it seemed to me that the executive branch of the government, I should have said perhaps, was presenting the case that would make people later on want to give.
In other words,
because it didn't ask exactly, you know,
right.
They simply presented the case.
Is this a fair impression that while no one asked you, Colonel North didn't ask you, and White House officials didn't ask you, but nonetheless, it was Mr. Channel who asked you for the contributions, but you really recognized that this was a request coming from the principals at the White House?
Oh, yes, that it was the executive department of the White House.
And when Colonel North identified a Contra need, for instance, a truck, a plane, or whatever, and then Mr. Channel asked you for a certain amount of money, you understood that that amount of money was going to be allocated to the purchase of those items or for those items?
Yes, sir.
I have another little question for you, Mrs. Garwood. You mentioned your disappointment upon learning that Mr. Channel, whom you had once described as being someone who was desirous of helping his country, you learned, I think from Mr. Messing, that Mr. Channel was getting or taking 35% over his needs, and you were terribly disappointed and surprised. Is that correct?
That's correct. I do consider his chief motivation in all of this, though, to have been a patriotic motivation. He just made
you mean that he was mixing a little patriotism with a little profiteering, though?
Well, I suppose you could put it that way. But the patriotism came first.
But you were disappointed when you learned that.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Mr. Broomfield?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Boyle, I have a few questions for you, if you don't mind. At your March 86 briefing on the Nicaragua situation from Colonel North, what did Colonel North say was the reason the Contras needed the anti-aircraft missiles?
I remember it was discussed that the Soviet Union had recently supplied to Nicaragua a new kind of attack helicopter, a Hind helicopter, which was very effective at gunning down forces on the ground. And I can't remember whether Colonel North actually said this in that particular briefing or not, but the idea was that the anti-aircraft missiles would be used to shoot down those helicopters.
At the briefing, what, if anything, did Colonel North say about the Sandinistas in Nicaragua violating the human rights of Nicaraguans and about their building military facilities, such as the air base?
Well, I described the purpose of the air base, one of the purposes, which was apparently the backfire bombers after a nuclear attack on the United States can't make it all the way back to Russia. So rather than lose them, they can recover them in Nicaragua. That's one of the purposes of building that air base. And the other purpose was that mission that I described to you, which could be flown up the west coast of the United States. In terms of human rights, I don't really have anything to say, except that I think that a communist regime, by its very nature, is not interested in human rights at all.
At your breakfast meeting on March 28, 1986, with Channel and North, did North tell you that he could not ask for money for the Contras because he worked for the government?
Yes.
Did Colonel North himself ever solicit funds from you?
No, he never did.
You met at various times with Colonel North. What is your judgment of his motivation as well as his integrity?
I think he is a man of very high integrity, and I think he's motivated principally by his sense of duty.
Channel told you on March 28, 1986, that he had checked you out overnight. You took that to mean that he had access to some national security computer. Did Channel actually tell you he had access to some computer?
No.
At the Hay Adams hotel dinner, apparently on March 27, 1986, who first mentioned the idea of you contributing money to the Contras?
Well, I brought it up myself.
Channel told you that those who made a $300,000 contribution to the Contras got to meet the President. Do you have any first-hand knowledge that that's what Channel told you is true?
No.
When you made your contribution of $130,000, did you tell Channel that you were not making your contribution to get in to see the President?
Yes.
You met at various times with Carl Channel. What is your judgment of his integrity?
I don't feel I'm in a position to make a judgment.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, sir. I have a couple of questions for you, Mr. O'Boyle, but first I want to say that I'm glad to see back with us again Tommy Loeffler, a former member of Congress from Texas. We're glad to see you here, smiling, happy, cheerful. But Mr. O'Boyle, was there any doubt in your mind that the $160,000 you contributed was for weapons?
Well, I believe that $130,000 that I contributed went to buy 2 MAL aircraft, and that the $30,000 I later contributed was for some other kind of humanitarian aid.
Now, as a highly educated, successful businessman, didn't you have some concern about Channel's operation when you were told that providing funds would be for a war in another country was tax deductible?
I was concerned about that, yes.
And did the printed material that you got from Channel indicate that it would be tax deductible?
Well, the principal activity of NEPL, as I understood it, was to sponsor and fund television commercials which were of an educational nature, and that was, as far as I could see, a deductible kind of activity. Buying equipment or weapons left a question mark in my mind.
The IRS regs 501c3 describe tax-exempt organizations as pretty generally worthwhile operations, not including publishing or distributing, political campaign, et cetera, but safety and educational purposes and so forth. But it has a very strong prohibition, Section B, that says you may not deduct contributions of gifts to foreign organizations. And there's a good many other things in the list, but foreign organizations is pretty clearly laid out. And at that April 18th, 86 lunch in New York with Chanel after your $130,000 contribution, you indicated that you did express some concerns about that legality, and Chanel said that the money couldn't be traced. Didn't this concern you even more?
It did concern me in a certain way, but then I felt that since this was a covert foreign policy operation that had the blessing of the administration, that it was all right.
You testified that when you met Mr. Chanel in late March of last year, he said if you contributed $300,000, President Reagan would meet with you privately and demonstrate his appreciation. Was Colonel North ever present when this was discussed, and did he ever confirm that?
Well, let's see now. Colonel North was present when that was discussed, and he didn't confirm it or deny it.
But 300,000, 15 minutes, that figures out $1.2 million an hour. That's a pretty good rate. You might have to deduct, what? This fixture, you know, is getting $20,000 a month for that, or $50,000 a video. You have to deduct that as a cost. You'd still have a pretty good yield. But you only gave $160,000, so you never did have a meeting with the president. Is that right?
I never sought a meeting with the president.
Did you know how Nepal got your name for the invitation to the White House briefing?
Yes, it was through an old acquaintance, a friend in Texas.
You still a friend? No, I don't answer that question. Was that initial invitation billed as a secret briefing?
I don't think so, no. The initial briefing by North, you mean?
Yes, sir.
I don't think it was. I don't think so.
When you were invited back to Washington for a briefing by North in late April of 1986, did you take that meeting to be a solicitation for more money?
By channel, yes.
And at this briefing in Colonel North's office, what was discussed?
Well, we discussed this plan that I had mentioned before. We discussed the fact that Colonel North was concerned about the Russian intelligence services trying to discredit him. I remember wondering whether we were involved in the beginning of World War III here, and said no, Russia would never go up against us to save Nicaragua. That's about it.
Didn't you feel that it was a little strange that a White House official in the White House was discussing a secret plan with you?
Well, not really. Not really.
Have they done that often?
No, but I at one point did have a security clearance, top secret security clearance. They must have known that. I had demonstrated by my actions that I was willing to support the administration in its efforts in this department, far more than the average person could. So I think they were justified in a certain way in not treating me as an average person off the street.
No further questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir.
Mr. McCullum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Boyle, I want to follow up on something before I go to other questions. Do you know if any other contributor or any other contributors were told by Spitz Channel that if they gave a contribution, they could see the President?
Spitz Channel, I don't know whether he told them that, but I understood from what he was saying that that was part of the arrangement.
Well, and Mrs. Garwood, indeed, you actually did see the President, and you had not been told that you had to give money before you saw him. Isn't that true?
That's true, yes.
And therefore, Mr. O'Boyle, isn't it possible that you might have actually been the only one that Spitz Channel told this story to? I mean, for all you know?
For all I know, yes.
Thank you. Mrs. Garwood, I really appreciate your being here today. You've been putting up with us for quite some time, and it's cold and chilly in this room. I've noticed that myself from early this morning, so we're grateful you're here, and I'm going to be very brief, but I would like to clarify just a couple of things with you if I could. I'd like to just make sure that the record's very clear on these points. At any time at all, did President Reagan personally ever ask you to contribute anything to the Contras?
No, sir, absolutely not.
At any time at all, did Colonel North or any other administration official ever ask you to contribute anything to the Contras?
No, sir.
And did it appear to you, Mrs. Garwood, during these various occasions where you did encounter Colonel North, that he actually went out of his way, especially being careful, to not ask you to contribute?
It did occur to me that he was doing that.
Thank you. Mrs. Garwood, you've testified about this incident with regard to your tax return this time and taking a deduction or not that your counsel has discussed. May I assume, and I would assume this normally since that would be my anticipation as an attorney in an attorney-client situation, but may I assume that you relied on your attorney and his advice with regard to taking that deduction and the manner in which it was done?
Yes, sir, and on Pete, Marwick, and Mitchell, who are my accountants.
Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Garwood, it seems to me you've described the opportunity to listen, and you took advantage of it several times to presentations with regard to the problems in Central America by Colonel North and by others. As I recall, you said Mr. Abrams was present, and there were quite a few presentations over the several months that you were involved in listening to these discussions. And you gave quite a bit of money when Mr. Channel asked you to give to his organization, and that's been laid very much before us today. But I think what's missing from all of this, despite innuendos about it, is anybody asking you, or you're having the opportunity to tell us beyond the fact that these were laid out, why you gave. What motive did you have? Why were you concerned with the Contras and the freedom fighters in the first place? And I'd like for you to tell us that, if you would, briefly, if you could.
I have been concerned about the communist threat to the United States ever since way back in 1947. At that time, Will Clayton, who was Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, wrote his first memorandum dated March 5th of 1947.
And Will Clayton was your father, right?
Yes, sir, for the Marshall Plan.
Please.
And in that first memo, he states very clearly that the communists are even then a threat to our country. He says, "I am deeply disturbed by the present world picture and its implications for our country. The reins of world leadership are fast slipping from Britain's once competent but now very weak hands. These reins will be picked up either by the United States or by Russia. If by Russia, there will almost certainly be war in the next decade or so, with the odds against us, even then when we were ahead militarily. Now we're, of course, behind them militarily. If by the United States, if the reins are picked up by the United States, war can almost certainly be prevented. But the United States must take world leadership, and quickly, to avert world disaster. It will not take world leadership effectively unless the people of the United States are shocked into doing so. To shock them, it is only necessary for the President and the Secretary of State to tell them the truth and the whole truth. The truth is to be found in the cables, which daily arrive at the State Department from all over the world. Then he says several nations whose integrity and independence are vital to our interests, just as Central America's independence is vital to our interests, and to our security, are on the very brink and may be pushed over at any time. Others are gravely threatened. If Greece and Turkey succumb, the whole Middle East will be lost. France may then capitulate to the communists. As France goes, all Western Europe and North Africa will go. These things must not happen. They need not happen. And then he says, we must go all out in this world game, or we'd better stay at home and devote our brains and energies to preparation for the Third World War. Well, I interviewed my father in order to write my book about him. And he told me, he gave me this early memorandum. This does not all come out in the Marshall speech. He made some other memos for the Marshall speech, too, telling how much each country in Europe would need financially. But this showed me that he was terribly worried. And you know that Greece and Turkey were both given military equipment and advisors by the United States to get the communists out. And I thought this set something of a precedent.
As I recall, we gave a lot more money to them in Greece, if I recall, than we've given it all ever in Central America at that time. And that was when the dollar was worth a whole lot more than it is today.
Yes.
And so this stimulated your interest, particularly, Mrs. Garwood, in Central America because of the concern down there. Were you aware, are you aware of the situation in Central America right now as far as it being a threat? Do you see it as a threat to the United States, to our security?
I do see it as a threat, particularly what Mr. O'Boyle said about the airfield being built for communist planes to patrol our west coast as well as our east. And I knew that. That comes out in lots of conservative publications that one receives and newsletters. And you don't see it in the daily press, but you see it very much in the conservative newsletters that one receives. And of course, ever since Cuba, there has been reason to be very concerned because we had an eyeball-to-eyeball situation there. And if we had supported the freedom fighters who wanted to reclaim Cuba for freedom at the Bay of Pigs, we would be in a different situation now.
Well, Mrs. Garwood, some of us greatly appreciate that there are Americans who really care out there and are interested in and concerned, because not always is that the case. Mr. Coors, I want to ask you a couple of questions relative to your testimony, if I could, sir. You've discussed with us this morning the meeting that you had with Director Casey in his office, and I believe the initial council question suggested that it was you who initiated the meeting. I gather that Director Casey didn't approach you to have a meeting. You did. Is that correct?
I approached the CIA director.
And did you advise Director Casey or his office what you wanted to talk about before you went?
No.
And so you arrived and had a visit, and this telephone call or arrangement was made afterwards for you to go down and visit Colonel North. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Did you ever get the impression, and somehow that may be left here, and if it isn't right, I don't want it to be, but if it is right, I would. Did you ever get the impression that Director Casey and Colonel North were setting you up to be asked to contribute for the plane? Now, was that pre-planned, did you think?
No, I would be almost certain that they weren't trying to set me up in any way, because I don't think they had any indication of my intentions ahead of that. I had not discussed with Bill Casey previous to that meeting my thoughts about wanting to help. So he was caught completely cold with my request.
So as far as you know, the whole process was a coincidence in terms of the plane being asked for and
well,
so forth.
Yeah, I am sure that Ollie North had done some background work on wanting a plane. But as far as I know, and I feel fairly certain that there was no previous plan involved in presenting that to me.
Mr. Coors, when you initially talked to Director Casey, you indicated an interest in a humanitarian contribution, didn't you?
I did, yes.
Did you feel that this plane was a humanitarian contribution?
Oh, I did very definitely. I see nothing in a plane of that type, a little type, Piper Cub type of plane, that if you want, anybody'd be crazy to go over enemy territory in that, because you could be shot down with a rifle. It's just a tiny little slow-flying 120-mile-an-hour aircraft that can be used for just carrying materials from one base to another.
You've made other personal and educational contributions for humanitarian educational purposes, haven't you, Mr. Coors?
I certainly have, yes.
Could you just, without going into all of them, because I suspect there are numerous, could you give us a couple of examples of that?
Well, major contributions have been made by my wife Holly and me to the Heritage Foundation, Free Congress Foundation. We work through our foundation and personally with a good number, the National Legal Center for Public Interest, the American Strategy Information Center. Guys, there are dozens of them actually that we do support.
Mr. Coors, the Heritage Foundation, for example, is an educational think tank organization quite prominent here in Washington, is it not?
Yes.
Thank you. I understand that you are quite good personal friends of the President, President Reagan. Is that correct?
I consider that I'm a friend of the President, yes.
Well, some of them have said you've even been a member of his kitchen cabinet, but at least you know him well enough to go see him when you want to occasionally, I assume.
Yes, I first met the President in 1968 when he was governor of California, and I've gotten to know him over the years quite well.
Did President Reagan ever at any time ask you to make a contribution to the Contras?
No, he has not, and actually I've never discussed the Contra freedom fighter situation with him. I only know what he thinks and through what he says through the press.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coors. Mr. Chairman, I think something needs to be clarified for the record in regard to the whole panel that's testifying here today. It might appear to the casual observer that the three who are here with us, well, I really appreciate all coming and testifying, it might appear that these are typical contributors to the Spitz Channel organization, or in the case of Mr. Coors, more directly to the Contras. But from my understanding of the depositions and the various taking of testimony that went on and efforts to get statements from folks before, many contributors were interviewed and deposed and not asked to testify because they did not have a list like was involved with Mrs. Garwood, or they didn't have an occasion where they were suggested to them that they might see the President if they gave money, and they didn't give to the Lake Resources account. I just simply want to make it clear to everybody who's involved, and I think it needs to be, that these three witnesses are not the typical contributors, and in fact many others gave more money to Mr. Channel's organization. No list was found in those cases. Nobody else was told that they had to see the President or could see the President if they gave money, and no other private contributor, at least that we discovered, received or sent his money to Lake Resources. I think that needs to be clearly stated and presented so that the public and everyone else understands that while these are three important witnesses, and I'm grateful, I'm sure the whole committee is, that they have come forward and given us a fuller picture of the situation of the contributions, I think it's important that we also put their cases in perspective. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I only have one or two short questions for Mr. Coors. In response to Mr. McCollum's questions, you indicated that you have given to, contributed through the years to a multitude of
a policy not to send contributions to foreign entities.
So this is the only...
This was a very specific situation, and I could have done it otherwise. I could have given him a personal check. I probably could have brought in cash.
He didn't suggest that, did he?
No, he didn't. He said, any way you want to do it. I said, what is the easiest way? And he suggested this. And so I
why did you ask him any questions about the Swiss bank account when he suggested that?
No, I didn't. And surprisingly enough, I guess to you people, when that name was given, he didn't remember the account number. He didn't mention Lake Resources when I discussed it with him. And when I passed that on, my recollection of the fact it was Lake Resources completely was out of my memory until I was asked to look at this particular piece of paper. In other words, it wasn't, it didn't enter my mind that it was Lake Resources. I didn't know at that time, and I didn't know until recently, that Lake Resources was under the control of General Secord.
And did you know General Secord?
No.
You didn't
Best
know?
of my knowledge, I've never met him.
Okay. You didn't know Mr. Hakim?
No.
And that's the only time you've ever made a contribution through a Swiss bank account?
That is correct.
And Colonel North didn't explain why it ought to go through a Swiss bank account?
No, he just, he indicated to me that that was a mechanism which would allow the funds to be used to buy this Maul aircraft. And it seemed to be a very simple, easy way to do, because all I had to do is write my bank and ask them to make the electronic transfer.
Where was the aircraft being bought from? The U.S. or?
It was, yeah. The airplane was a plane of the Maul Air Inc., I think is the name of the company. And I believe it's a Florida company. The plane, according to Colonel North, was there. It was had been assembled. It was ready for immediate purchase.
If you'd send the money to the Swiss bank account, they could send it back to Florida and pick up the plane right away.
That's right.
Sounds like a very simple.
Well, it's an easy way to do it, I guess. Yeah. It seemed to be.
He was, you've learned today, beginning a fleet of those.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear Mr. O'Boyle's testimony. I have, subsequent to that, Colonel North has shown me a picture of what he said was my plane.
Really?
Down in the jungles of Honduras.
When did he do that?
Well, that was last fall.
Well, did you see, was it a photograph of just one? Was there several?
No, there's only one.
Really?
Yep. He showed me photographs of other aircraft. There was a DC-3, an old DC-3, but I didn't see any other Mauls. This was a single plane on a small airstrip. You see, they'll take off, as I understand, take off and land at maybe 150, 200 feet.
Yeah.
It's a very remarkable type of plane.
Yeah.
And ideally suited to that tax-exempt 501c3s and non-tax-exempt political entities.
I see. Of all of these dozens of contributions through the years, have you ever been asked to send one to a Swiss bank account, except this one?
No, I pretty much have a policy not to send contributions to foreign entities.
So this is the only...
This was a very specific situation. And I could have done it otherwise. I could have given him a personal check. I probably could have brought in cash.
He didn't suggest that, did he?
No, he didn't. He said, any way you want to do it. I said, what is the easiest way? And he suggested this. And so I
why did you ask him any questions about the Swiss bank account when he suggested that?
No, I didn't. And surprisingly enough, I guess, to you people, when that name was given, he didn't remember the account number. He didn't mention Lake Resources when I discussed it with him. And when I passed that on, my recollection of the fact it was Lake Resources completely was out of my memory until I was asked to look at this particular piece of paper. In other words, it wasn't, it didn't enter my mind that it was Lake Resources. I didn't know at that time, and I didn't know until recently, that Lake Resources was under the control of General Secord.
And did you know General Secord?
No.
To the best
of my knowledge, I've never met him.
Okay. You didn't know Mr. Hakim?
No.
And that's the only time you've ever made a contribution through a Swiss bank account?
That is correct.
And Colonel North didn't explain why it ought to go through a Swiss bank account.
No, he just, he indicated to me that that was a mechanism which would allow the funds to be used to buy this Maul aircraft. And it seemed to be a very simple, easy way to do, because all I had to do is write my bank and ask them to make the electronic transfer.
Where was the aircraft being bought from? The U.S. or?
It was, yeah, the airplane was a plane of the Maul Air Inc., I think is the name of the company. And I believe it's a Florida company. The plane, according to Colonel North, was there. It was had been assembled. It was ready for immediate purchase.
If you'd send the money to the Swiss bank account, they could send it back to Florida and pick up the plane right away.
That's right.
Sounds like a very simple.
Well, it's an easy way to do it, I guess. Yeah. It seemed to be.
He was, you've learned today, beginning a fleet of those.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear Mr. O'Boyle's testimony. I have, subsequent to that, Colonel North has shown me a picture of what he said was my plane.
Really?
Down in the jungles of Honduras.
When did he do that?
Well, that was last fall.
Well, did you see? Was it a photograph of just one? Was there several?
No, there's only one.
Really?
Yeah. He showed me photographs of other aircraft. There was a DC-3, an old DC-3, but I didn't see any other Mauls. This was a single plane on a small airstrip. You see, they'll take off, as I understand, take off and land in maybe 150, 200 feet.
Yeah.
It's a very remarkable type of plane.
Yeah.
And ideally suited to that land. That
sounds like a small C-5A.
Well, I guess.
Yeah.
C-5A, no, sir. I think the maximum load that this plane will carry is less than 500 pounds. Is that right? Tiny plane.
I think I only have one further question, maybe for. Yeah, I do want to ask you. Of course, was this a tax-deductible gift for you?
Oh no, sir. No way.
Yeah.
It didn't go through any organization at all. So
right.
And I didn't take it as a tax exempt.
You didn't know whether or not Lake Resources was.
Well,
I think it really was a 501c3 according to the general. You may want to.
No, maybe I'll have to go back and look at that, but I don't think I will under the circumstances.
Of course, you can see the president any time. That never did come up.
I beg your pardon, sir?
Colonel North never did mention anything about $300,000 for you could see the president, because you can see him whenever.
Well, I'm not sure I can see him anytime I want,
I mean,
but I do.
You've been friends for years.
Yes, I've been in to see him a good number of times.
Yes.
And that never came up. I never had any direct other requests for contributions to the freedom fighter.
I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Garwood. Mrs. Garwood?
Yes, sir.
In the very front.
Oh.
I'm here.
Didn't see you.
He's the chairman.
Mr. Chairman. Yes.
I gather from your testimony this morning and from the deposition that was taken by the staff that you were convinced that the administration was aware of your contribution?
From my testimony, you thought?
Yes.
Well, they certainly were aware of the contributions that I had made, the tax-deductible humanitarian aid, yes.
And that the administration was supportive of the contribution?
Certainly. The president himself had said so publicly many times, that he wanted private people to give humanitarian aid to the Nicaraguan.
So you were making the contribution
resistance.
because the administration wanted the contribution?
Yes, sir.
When you say administration, who do you mean by the administration?
I mean the executive branch of the administration, particularly.
Is it any person, or is it just some vague thing
No,
that
it
we
isn't
have?
very vague. I mean, of course, we know who's the president, and we know whose cabinet are.
So you had no doubts that the president wanted.
No doubts at all.
Mr. O'Boyle, I think your testimony also says the same. Did you at any time doubt that the president wanted this?
No, sir. I don't know if he knew of my specific contribution, but I felt that he was supportive of this program.
That he was aware of the solicitation program?
Yes.
That he was supportive of the solicitation program?
Yes.
During this morning's testimony, I'm sorry I wasn't here all the time, but as I walked in, you spoke of secret information that was provided you by Colonel North. Did I hear correctly?
Yes.
Were you at that moment cleared to receive secret information?
I should say Colonel North didn't characterize it exactly as this is classified information, which I'm now giving you. But the way he put it was, this is very secret. You can't tell anybody about this. And I took that to mean classified.
Did he, I am now quoting from your deposition. I want to know if you still believe in this. He, that's North, indicated that our intelligence services had intercepted instructions from the KGB to the Nicaraguan representative to the United Nations. Did he use the word intercepted?
I don't recall if he used that exact words.
Why did you use the word intercepted?
Well, that's my best recollection.
And you said that you had clearance once upon a time.
Yes.
Intercepts would be highly classified, won't they?
Yes.
Mr. Kaur, am I correct that your testimony this morning and the deposition which you provided, you've indicated that you were convinced that the administration was first knowledgeable of the solicitation program?
No, I don't think I said that at all in my testimony, Mr. Chairman.
Are you convinced that the administration was aware of the solicitation program?
I know that the president was supportive of the freedom fighters in Nicaragua, but I know nothing directly of any attempt that he has made or any request that he has made for private funds for that purpose.
Would you have provided the contribution if the president had been opposed to it?
I would doubt that. I felt I was doing something that was in accordance with a program that he was supportive of.
So you were convinced that the administration was in favor of it?
Very much so.
And the fact that you had met with officials of the administration convinced you of that?
Not so much, I think, that as the fact that the people that I have talked to and heard talk about the situation down there convinced me that it was a serious situation, convinced me that it was a situation that would be detrimental, could be detrimental to the United States by establishing a communist beachhead in the center of Central America. I feel strongly that that is something that could eventually destroy our country, because I think if it happened, if we're allowed to happen in Nicaragua, it will spread into El Salvador, Costa Rica, on up into Guatemala, perhaps Mexico, then we could have a whole communistic regime in all of Central America right on our southern border. And that's, to me, intolerable.
When you were instructed to make your charitable contribution to a secret Swiss account, were you convinced that this was a covert activity?
First of all, sir, it was not a charitable contribution. I don't want to classify it as that because I didn't consider it as charitable. I considered it as a contribution to do something on a humanitarian basis to help people who were struggling for their lives and struggling for freedom.
Isn't that a charitable contribution?
Well, charitable contributions in some very often are taken to be contributions to tax-deductible organizations. I knew this was not of that type. Charitable from the standpoint of helping humanity, yes.
But it was for a secret project.
Well, it was as far as I was concerned, I wanted to keep it quiet, my contribution. The purchase of the plane, I don't think was a secret in any way. It certainly was not secret when the plane got into the Honduran, the Nicaraguan freedom fighters' hands. It was not supposed to be used for a secret purpose, sir.
Wasn't it strange that you made your payments through a Swiss account?
Not particularly, because as I expressed to Mr. Jenkins, it seemed to be the simplest way to do it. I suppose I could have sent a check directly to the Mall Air Incorporated.
Which you did not.
Which I did not, yes.
You're a sophisticated businessman, the chief operating executive of Coors. What sort of people make Swiss accounts, open up Swiss accounts?
I haven't any idea. I have never opened one up. I don't know of any friends who have them, and I'm not generally involved or sophisticated in that area.
Well, I thank you very much. I thank all of you for participating with us this morning. You've been extremely helpful. Senator Rudman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We all appreciate your testimony this morning, and obviously you're here to give us information. All of you exercised your rights as individual Americans to do what you wish to do, and we all understand that. I want to ask Ms. Garwood a question, because we've kind of got well, I guess I can best describe it as a theory that is legal fiction, not by Mrs. Garwood, but generally floating around, that somehow, because you were never asked directly by certain people to give money, that they didn't ask you. I want to just go through a meeting that hasn't been covered, but is covered in your deposition. There was a meeting in Dallas in September of '85, if I'm correct, of the U.S. Council of World Freedom, and Mr. Channel went to that meeting and said he wanted to take you to meet Colonel North at the airport following the meeting, because Colonel North was going to be coming through Dallas and was going to stop to meet. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Calero was also at that meeting of the U.S. Council, I believe.
Yes, he was.
And Mr. Channel, Mr. North met with you at the airport that day.
Yes.
And Mr. North told you of the, according to your deposition, that there was a need for all sorts of things down in Nicaragua, particularly, I believe, possibly trucks and other supplies.
Yes, he told me the terrible news that supplies had arrived, but there was no way to transport them. Much as supplies arrived to feed the starving people of Ethiopia, and they were left on the docks and rotted.
And they didn't have trucks to move them with.
That's right.
And then Colonel North left. And then Mr. Channel took you back to your hotel in the cab. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then essentially within a short time frame after Colonel North telling you, Mrs. Garwood, that trucks were needed, Mr. Channel said to you, Mrs. Garwood, you can help.
Yes, sir.
And in fact, you did.
Yes, I did.
Then and there, you issued a check, or shortly thereafter, for
Yeah.
$32,000.
Yes.
That's what, you know, where I come from, we call that the old 1-2 punch, is what we call that.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I don't speak Texas, but let me see if I can explain it. Colonel North was telling you of a terrible need, knowing that you were a person of some means, but obviously was precluded, or thought he was precluded, from asking directly for money. But he set forth this dire situation, and moments later, his friend, who took you to the airport to meet him, coincidentally, asked you for money.
Yes, sir. I think what Colonel North and Mr. Channel both knew mostly about me was not that I had a lot of funds so much as that I was deeply interested in protecting the independence of the United States, and that the target of the Soviets is not really Nicaragua, it's our country. And anything that I could do to help those freedom-seeking people prevent another Cuba down there and a Soviet stronghold was really to defend our country.
Oh, I agree with you, Mrs. Garwood.
Yes.
I'm sure.
And that I would easily want to give what I could.
And obviously, Colonel North was telling you of the sad plight of these people, and then moments later, Mr. Channel would ask you for money, and that's what I call the 1-2 punch.
Well, it really didn't, they didn't have to do a 1-2 punch with me because they knew I was already so interested and so eager to help, to defend our country, that all they had to do was ask me, and if I had it, I'd give it.
Right. Okay, I think that, you know, I've made the point, and that's a very good example, because that didn't take place here in Washington. Colonel North made a special stop in Dallas to talk to Mrs. Garwood, to tell Mrs. Garwood about the sad plight which we all understand, and many of us in this panel have supported, to help those people in Central America. But then, shortly after, you were solicited by Mr. Channel, and that, to me, it's a fiction for anyone to assume that somehow that's not a solicitation. The whole event was a solicitation done by two different people. Would you disagree with that?
It was clarifying for me beliefs that I already had, and showing me how desperate things were. They practically knew they didn't have to solicit anything from me, that if I could help simply, as Mr. Coors has said, he wanted to help, and Mr. O'Boyle, I didn't actually have to say it. They knew too much of my history to believe anything else. And so they didn't have to solicit. Well, I was more than eager to give.
Well, I appreciate that. Let me turn to Mr. O'Boyle. Mr. O'Boyle, you're a fairly sophisticated businessman with an interesting experience and believe deeply in this cause, as many people do. Did you see the scheme that was afoot here, where you would be briefed in the White House about all of these terrible problems, and then coincidentally would be solicited by someone else? You saw this as part of a general plan. These were not disconnected events, am I correct?
I didn't see them as disconnected.
Obviously. Let me ask both Mr. O'Boyle and Mr. Coors a question. It's the last one I have, Mr. Chairman, because I think that their testimony of all three witnesses were very forthright and complete. You gave $130,000 for two Maul airplanes, I believe, Mr. O'Boyle, and Mr. Coors, I believe you gave, was it 60 or 65? 65. 65, and that's for Maul airplanes. Who were those for, Mr. O'Boyle? Who were the airplanes for?
Well, they were to be used in support of the Contras. I don't know exactly who the people were who were flying them.
But assuming that somebody owned them, you assumed, I guess, that the Contra, the FDN would own them, if they would have them, didn't you?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if perhaps we had people who were flying them for the Contras. I really don't know.
But that was meant to be a donation to help the Contras.
Yes.
And I assume that's true with you.
Yes, it was my understanding the plane was going to be turned over to the Contras for their use in Honduras.
Are either of you a bit surprised, or were you a bit surprised, if you followed these hearings, to learn that General Secord, in his testimony, essentially says that those assets have belonged to Lake Resources and not to the Contras, and they were free to do with them what they wanted to do with them, including give them to the CIA or sell them to the CIA? There's a dispute about what they said, but but that they had the power to dispose of those assets?
I hadn't heard that previous to just now, and I am surprised and shocked that he would say that.
How about you, Mr. O'Boyle?
I'm surprised as well.
As far as you're concerned, you believe deeply in the cause. You made substantial contributions.
I didn't give this money to General Secord. I gave it to the freedom fighters in Honduras.
I think that's our clear understanding. I don't have any questions, Mr. Chairman. I would just say that I want to thank all three for coming. Mr. Coors, you said that for obvious reasons you wanted to keep, I guess, this a low profile or secret. I think one of the unintended results for Mr. Coors and Mrs. Garwood and Mr. O'Boyle after these hearings is you're going to get an incredible amount of mail from charitable organizations around the country because you're three of the most charitable people I've ever met.
We already do get those.
I'm sure you do.
One of the unfortunate things for me is, in my company, is that some people who don't believe in what I did are saying they won't buy Coors beer anymore, which is unfortunate.
Well, I can't believe that, Mr. Coors. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, let me assure Mr. Coors now on, I'll buy nothing but Coors beer.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank all of the witnesses for their testimony here today, and I have no questions.
Mr. Nunn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one line of questioning here. Will not take but just a few minutes. I'd like to ask Mr. Coors and Ms. Garwood whether you have ever been the recipients of classified information or secret information from the federal government.
I happen to have a secret clearance, and so I over the years, over the last 25 years, I've received a good deal of documents, secret documents. I understand the position and so forth. I have not received any from or seen anything of Colonel North's, from Colonel North.
You haven't received anything about Central America?
I have not, no.
From anyone?
I would have no need to know, and I think the clearance procedure is such that you're supposed to have a need to know.
You're supposed to have classification clearance plus need to know.
Need to know. I have the classification clearance.
But you keep a classification clearance, is that right?
That is correct.
In what status? What status is that?
Well, that's as an executive of our companies. Our Coors Porcelain Company particularly is involved in classified work for the government on a fairly regular basis.
So it's on a need to know related to your company activities?
That is correct.
But you haven't received anything from any governmental official about Central America?
I have not, no.
Ms. Garwood, could I ask you the same question? Have you received any classified information or secret information from any governmental official regarding Central America or any other subject?
No, sir, I have not.
And the briefings you went to in the White House, you did not receive classified information to your knowledge?
No, sir.
Mr. Boyle, let me ask you just a few questions following up on Chairman Inouye's question. When did this classified briefing occur that you have alluded to?
Well, again, I'm not sure whether it's correct to describe it as a classified briefing.
Well, the secret information you were receiving, whatever you would like, whatever term you'd like to use.
When? It was April 29th, in 1986.
April 29th, 1986. Where did that occur?
At Colonel North's office in the White House.
In the White House. And who was present there?
Myself and Colonel North.
Just the two of you?
Yes. At the beginning of the meeting, Mr. Channel was there, and then Mr. Channel left, and Colonel North and I continued the meeting together.
Was Mr. Channel there when the secret information was being discussed?
No.
You're sure of that?
Yes.
So he had left before that discussion took
Yes.
place? And was Colonel North dealing with written material? Did you see any written material?
There was a map.
And did they have anything stamped on the map like secret?
I don't remember.
Did you look at the map?
Yes.
Was the map on a desk or was it on the wall or where was it?
It was on the wall.
It was on the wall. Did he say that the map was secret?
No.
What did you understand was secret?
Well, I asked him, what is the plan in Nicaragua? What is our plan? Why are we raising all of this money? What's going on here? And he proceeded to outline the plan for me.
Was he referring to anything in writing when he outlined that plan?
No.
So it was oral?
Yes.
And was the plan the U.S. government plan, or was it the Contra plan, or was it both?
I assumed that it was the U.S. government's plan.
It related to the United States government's planning in Nicaragua and Central America.
Yes.
Did it relate to political matters or military matters or both?
Both.
So it did have military matters involved.
Yes.
Did it relate to Pentagon planning, Department of Defense, CIA, one, either, both?
I would say it related to the Pentagon. It would probably involve all of those.
Both of those organizations?
The Pentagon and the CIA?
Yes.
I would say so, yes.
Did he give you any names of people involved?
No, he didn't refer to people in the Pentagon or in the CIA, but he described an overall political and military plan.
So it was an overall military. Did he ask you at any time whether you had any kind of security clearance?
No.
Did you volunteer whether you had or not?
No.
Do you have a security clearance?
Not currently, no.
You have had one that's not current?
Yes.
Were you in the military?
Yes.
And when was that security clearance last validated?
1965.
So you haven't had one since 1965?
That's right.
Did he never mention that, and you never mentioned that?
That's right.
Did he tell you anything about revealing this information to anyone else?
Yes. He said that this was very, very secret information. I should not reveal it to anyone else.
So he said it was very, very secret?
Yes.
And you assumed from that it was classified information?
Yes.
Did he tell you what category of classification it was? Did he ever mention top secret or code word or secret or confidential?
No, he didn't.
Or no foreigners or anything of that nature?
No.
So he just, very, very secret is the best description he gave you?
Yes. The way he put it was, you can't tell this to anybody.
Can't tell this to anybody. Did you ever discuss it with anyone else until these hearings?
I discussed it with my attorney, and I discussed it in my deposition.
You discussed it with your attorney privately?
Privately, and it's in my deposition.
And who is your attorney?
I am here. You also discussed it with the special prosecutor.
And with the special prosecutor.
Did you discuss the substance with your attorney?
Yes.
Is your attorney got clearance?
No.
No, not to my knowledge, no.
So you have discussed it with someone who did not have a clearance?
I don't have a clearance.
So you figure if you don't, it doesn't matter from that point on.
I figure my attorney, I've got to be able to talk to somebody, and my attorney's relationship is privileged.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Can I get back to you for a minute, please?
Oh, yes, sir.
It slipped my mind. I don't know why. As a civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army, we have meetings once a year of all the CASAs in Washington, and I am Secretary for the 6th Army, so I go out to the Presidio quite often. And in some of those conferences, we do have secret briefings.
But that is in connection with your official duties
That is in connection with my official duties as a civilian aide to the Secretary.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that
wanted to-
clarification. Mr. O'Boyle, did you tell anyone else about this information other than the prosecutors, people involved in this investigation on the committee, the staff and so forth, and your attorney?
No.
Did you tell your wife?
No.
No children, no family? So the only person you told outside the chain of investigators was your attorney?
That's right.
And I assume that's your attorney's the only person you told that you know of that did not have a clearance?
Yes, that's right. And the grand jury for the special prosecutor.
The grand jury?
It's our system, Senator.
Did anyone ask you whether you were revealing classified information, the prosecutor, before you gave it to the grand jury?
I had told the prosecutors that this was what Colonel North told me. But then they put the question to me, and I was required to answer.
So the special prosecutor, did he ask you whether this was classified information beforehand?
I don't know myself whether it's classified. It was told to me that this was most secret, I can't tell anyone, but he didn't say, look, this is secret, this is top secret. He didn't lay it out for me that way.
Mr. Chairman, this goes back to the old saying, he can keep a secret, it's the folks he tells that we worry about. I think that that is a little lesson on how things spread in the classified world. Mr. O'Boyle, thank you very much. Thank all of you for being here, Mr. Coors, Ms. Garwood.
Mr. Fasell.
Well, are you now or have you ever been a contractor for the United States government?
No.
In your determination to assist the country with respect to this matter as a patriotic gesture, you wouldn't advocate setting aside the laws of the country or the Constitution of the United States, would you?
No.
Everything you'd want to do you would want it to be constitutional and within the law, would you not?
Yes.
Mr. Coors, you have a security clearance because you're a civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army at the present time, and you're also a contractor for the United States government.
Yes, I'm a member of the board of a organization that's a contractor.
And your security clearance is current.
Yes, it is.
Now, you went to Bill Casey, your friend, at the time you were approached about helping out your country, to get advice from Bill Casey as to whether or not this was the right thing to do. That's what I understood you to say.
No, I don't think I asked him whether it was the right thing to do, because I was convinced that what I had intended to do and wanted to do was
right.
entirely legal and constitutional.
No, that's not what I meant.
I didn't.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I asked him for advice as to what I could do.
I see. Well, he was a good lawyer.
Yes, he was.
Did you ask him whether or not the U.S. government was really behind this particular request?
What request?
Whatever it is that you were going to do.
They didn't make any request of me, sir.
Well, whatever it is you wanted to do.
No, I did not ask him that.
And he didn't volunteer?
He didn't volunteer.
So why did he send you to Colonel North?
Well, because he was a friend and I wanted to do something, and he said this is the person to go to get it done.
And so you went to Ollie North's office in the White House and
I did, yes.
And cut the deal?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You never gotten any political conversations with Ollie North about how important it was to get the president's programs adopted and get rid of some of these congressmen that didn't agree with him?
Not from that latter angle. I've gotten to know North over a number of meetings and situations, and I've talked to him certainly about the political aspects of Nicaragua.
Oh, no, I just meant domestic politics, Mr. Coors,
I
just wondered whether or not he or Channel or Miller, or any of those guys had gotten to you about how important it was to get some money in the political campaign with regard to the president's program and working on the Congress to vote right.
Yeah, North never brought up the question of political funds. I don't know Mr. Channel and these other people, and so I never discussed the politics of trying to get certain kinds of people elected to the Congress. I do that in other areas.
Yeah, right. I understand that. I was going to say you got enough routes without having to rely on that organization. Okay. Let me ask Mrs. Garwood now. You're not a government contractor, are you, by any chance?
No, Mr. Chairman.
You don't have a security clearance?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, in your strongly held rationale with respect to helping the United States government do what you feel is necessary to keep the communists from overrunning the United States, you would not want to set aside the Constitution of the United States, and you would want to do everything within the law, would you not?
Certainly.
Now, all of your contributions have been very carefully followed, except I didn't hear, maybe I missed, but there were 3 in 86 Mrs. Garwood, one for $50,000, one for $41,000, and another for $30,000. That was February and March of 1986. And I just wondered if you could tell us from your notes what those contributions were for.
If they were to NEPL, which I suppose they were for humanitarian aid to the Nicaraguan democratic resistance. If they were made out to the American Conservative Trust, they could have been for some political activities, because that is it is not tax deductible.
Do you recall a conversation with Mr. Channel about withdrawing some funds from NEPL and then making those funds available to ACT or ATAC?
Mr. Channel called me and said that they had some surplus funds in NEPL, and would I be willing to have him refund some of the money I had given to NEPL and let him put it into the American Conservative Trust, and I told him yes.
Now, on the political activity that you were discussing, Channel was discussing with you the necessity for having some money to buy some newspaper ads?
Yes, he was always buying newspaper ads.
And it had to do with the current program before the Congress?
Some of them did, yes.
Did Ollie North discuss this with you?
Never.
He didn't call you and urge you to make a contribution to ATC or ATAC?
Colonel North would never have done that.
So if there's any testimony anywhere about a telephone call from Ollie North, that testimony is incorrect.
There was no telephone call from Colonel North.
And Channel and North and Miller never met with you at any one occasion with respect to the funding that they felt was absolutely essential to carry on the political program?
No, sir. I don't even know who Mr. Miller is.
And you remember no specific contribution going to ATC except the so-called surplus money?
There was a contribution to ATAC or ACT. No, I think I think I did make some other contributions to ACT in the beginning in 1984.
Okay, thank you very much.
I wish to advise the panel that in deference to the witnesses, we wish to conclude the questioning before the luncheon recess, and so I hope you'll keep that in mind. Senator Hatch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome all three of you here with your counsel. You're all honorable, patriotic, decent Americans, and we appreciate the difficulty that you find yourself in here today. Sorry that you're embroiled in this affair, but I want you to personally know I appreciate your intentions and what you were trying to do. I just want you to know that. Mrs. Garwood and Mr. O'Boyle, let me just ask each of you a question, just so it's clear in my mind. Was Mr. Channel's organization, the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty, ever represented as being an official organ or organization of the United States government? To either of you?
Never.
No.
Never was?
No.
Okay. Did you perceive the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty as a private organization? Is that the way you perceived it?
Yes.
Is that true, Mrs. Garwood?
Yes, sir.
As a purely private organization?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Mrs. Garwood, am I correct in my feeling that you remain committed to this day to the support of the Nicaraguan freedom fighters?
Yes, sir.
Mr. O'Boyle?
Yes.
You do. Well, even though the methods used in the fundraising in this particular instance, these efforts, may have been inappropriate, it seems to me that does not eliminate the need for America to support these freedom fighters in their fight for democracy. Would you agree with that?
I certainly would.
Mrs. Garwood?
Yes, sir.
Okay, now, in your meeting with the President, Mrs. Garwood, did the President indicate in any way that he knew of the amount of your contributions?
No, he did not.
Okay. Did the President indicate that he knew of Mr. Channel's representations that the donations would be tax deductible?
No, sir, he did not.
He did
In
not.
fact, reason for meeting with the President had nothing to do with donations
All
to
right.
the channel organizations.
I just want to make sure
Yes.
that this is clear. Did the President know that you were being asked to purchase arms?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, Mr. Coors, we have known each other for a long time. I have a great deal of respect for you and Holly, your wife. I admire you greatly,
Senator.
as you well know. But I'd like to ask you just basically one question. Do you personally feel that there's anything wrong with private American citizens giving financial support for freedom fighters in Nicaragua?
I do not, no.
You do not. Mr. O'Boyle, you did not meet with the President, is that right?
That's correct.
And as far as you know, even though Colonel North said you have to keep this secret from everybody, you don't know whether that was classified or not, the information he gave you.
That's right.
Okay. Now, the statements that Mr. Channel made to you regarding the President's meeting with persons who contributed a great deal of money does concern me. I want you to know that. Do you have any knowledge as to whether or not the President knew that his name was being used in that way?
I don't have any personal knowledge of that.
Okay. Now, Mrs. Garwood, you didn't see anything wrong with donating your own private funds to support the freedom fighters, did you?
No, sir. As I understand it, there's no prohibition for private funds being donated.
Well,
For
to you-
public funds, yes, but not private funds.
Right. To you, you were supporting really a policy against communism in this hemisphere, as you've expressed it here. Really a policy your father articulated when he supported the Marshall Plan.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you
And
fervently believe in that policy then?
Yes. He even pointed out, and I would like to say this because I left it out, that in every country in the Eastern Hemisphere and most of the countries of the Western Hemisphere, Russia was boring from within. He put that in, and he said, this is a new technique, this boring from within, with which we have not yet learned to cope, and we must cope with it and quickly or face the greatest peril of our history. So I feel that whenever I see biased newspaper reports in favor of the communist Nicaraguans or hear that sort of talk on television. I feel this is boring from within.
Well, I want to thank each of you. I think the real pathetic part of this is that none of you would ever have had to have contributed had we members of Congress supported the freedom fighters down there in their cause against oppression that really is occurring in Nicaragua. So I just want to personally thank you again for coming. I appreciate having you here.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Stokes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to pose an inquiry to the chair. In light of the questions posed to Mr. O'Boyle by Senator Nunn and the answers supplied relative to his questions, it would appear to me that there is no basis for us to assume that the information elicited from the witness is classified information. There does not appear to have been any classified document. Nothing was stamped. It would be my intention to pose several questions to the witness with reference to the so-called secret plan, and I'd ask for a ruling from the chair that this line of questioning would be proper.
Please proceed, sir.
Thank you. Mr. O'Boyle, you had made the inquiry yourself of Mr. North as to what was the plan for Nicaragua. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then in response to that, he then said to you something to the effect that he had shared with you, but it was really a secret. Is that correct?
Yes.
After that, then what did he say?
Are you requiring me to answer that?
Yes, sir.
He said that there were there was one plan that had two different, there were two plans in one, so to speak. One would be implemented if Congress approved the money last year for the Contras. One would be implemented if Congress did not approve the money. They involved the Nicaraguan Contras seizing a part of Nicaragua, establishing a provisional capital, a provisional government, and the U.S. Navy going down, blockading the country, preventing the supplies coming in from Cuba to support the Sandinistas. And at that point, supposedly the Sandinistas would fall, and the Contra government would come into power, and then Nicaragua would be restored to democracy. And if the Congress did approve the money, this would happen on a slower time scale, giving the Contras more time to consolidate their position. If they did not approve the money, it would happen on a shorter time scale, which would be something of a desperation move, but kind of a last-ditch effort, you might say, on the part of the Contras. That was the plan.
Did he say anything in terms of the plan of any involvement by the United States or its forces?
Yes, he indicated that part of the plan would involve having our Navy go down and blockade the country.
Now, is this your best recollection of the entire plan?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And after he had told you about the plan, did you say anything further to him?
We discussed one or two other matters that I've already reviewed here with you, but nothing else about that particular plan.
So that, in essence, was it?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Boyle.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think it should be noted that this is what Colonel North told Mr. O'Boyle, that no documents with the classified indicators placed thereupon were used for this briefing. Isn't that correct?
Only a map was used.
You don't?
I don't recall that it was classified.
So therefore, you're not certain whether the map itself was classified?
I don't think it was.
Thank you, sir. Senator Sobbings?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to be clear on one point. Mr. Coors, I take it you do not know Mr. Channel, is that correct?
To the best of my knowledge, I do not know.
So your contribution really was as a consequence of your discussion with Director Casey and your subsequent meeting with Colonel North.
That's correct.
Mr. O'Boyle, I take it your encounters, and I use an encounter to embrace meetings that perhaps were in sequence or very close to one another, invariably involved both Mr. Channel and Colonel North. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
So in a sense, they were a team. They might not have been there for both meetings, and maybe Channel took you to North, and then you met with North, and then subsequently you would meet with Channel. But in a sense, they worked as a team.
In a sense, yes.
Mrs. Garwood, is that true in your instance as well, with respect to Mr. Channel and Colonel North?
I would say that's a fairly accurate description.
And these meetings took place, these briefings you had took place in Colonel North's office, in the executive office building? Is that correct, Mr.
Yes,
O'Boyle?
Senator, yes.
And elsewhere? Did you have briefings elsewhere?
Yes, in the White House itself. You know, the briefing I described where Colonel North and Elliott Abrams and the President spoke was in a room in the White House.
Do you know where that was in the White House?
I couldn't tell you, I'm sorry.
All right, thank you. Mr. O'Boyle?
I'm sorry.
The briefings you received, where did they take place?
There was one meeting in the White House, in the old executive office building of the White House. Then another one with Colonel North in the same building, in his office. I met with him one other time, two other times away from the old executive office building.
In Washington?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hyde?
I'd like the record to show I have no questions.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Corder?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Boyle, very quickly, and we're going to go once again to this area of secret or non-secret. When you had the conversation with Oliver North, and he said he was going to show you something that was very secret, did he say it was a secret, or did he say it was classified some way secret?
As I recall, he said it was the way he said it was, you can't tell anybody about this.
Did he indicate to you that it was classified as top secret, secret, no foreign intelligence, code
No,
word,
no.
black program?
No, no.
And you said he showed you a map, that was the only document that he showed you?
Yes.
And he indicated, or you did not see on that document any type of classification designated thereon?
No.
How large was the map?
It was a wall map, perhaps 3 feet by 5 feet.
What did it
something
show?
like that. It showed Nicaragua.
Is that, did it
That's it.
appear to be a classified map with
No.
classified information on it?
No.
So he didn't show you anything, to your knowledge, that was in fact designated classified?
That's right.
And you did not see any other written thing besides a wall map, and on the map was Nicaragua and Central America?
That's right.
Thank you very much. It was secret, therefore, because he said, don't tell anybody.
Yes.
And for all you know, it may not have been classified one way or the other.
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. O'Boyle. Mr. or Mrs. Garwood, did anybody from the United States government show you anything that was designated classified?
No, sir, they did not.
Mr. Coors, did anybody from the United States government show you anything with respect to these transactions that was designated classified?
Not with respect to these transactions, but we have had classified briefings on Central America through the Army.
You've testified to that before?
I have. No, I just earlier I answered a question
That's what I
to
mean.
Senator Nunn in that respect.
Fine, thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Senator Cohen?
I take it that none of you feel that it's appropriate for private citizens to buy hand grenades and take a tax deduction. Is that correct?
Did you ask me?
All three of you.
I did not take a tax deduction, so it didn't apply. It doesn't apply.
But I assume that's correct, that you would not think it appropriate to be purchasing weapons and ammunition and taking tax deductions?
We have amended that,
Right.
and so there is no tax deduction.
Right. Same with you, Mr. O'Boyle.
I haven't taken a tax deduction.
And you wouldn't think it would be appropriate to do so?
I'd have to advise with my counsel on that.
Second point, Mr. O'Boyle, Oliver North told you the purpose of the aid that was either coming privately or through Congress was to, in essence, topple the Sandinista government? Isn't that what you just testified to?
Yes, yes.
So that was what you were told to keep secret?
The plan I was told to keep secret.
The plan was?
The plan involved toppling the Sandinistas, yes.
And one final question. Mrs. Garwood, you indicated on the White House there was a meeting on January of '86 and that Elliott Abrams was present at that time?
Yes, sir.
And the briefing took about an hour and a half?
Something like that.
And President Reagan only spoke a few moments at the very end?
Yes, sir.
And so most of the briefing was conducted, I take it, by either Colonel North or Elliott Abrams?
Yes.
Mr. DeWine.
Questions, Mr. Chairman?
Senator Heflin?
Well, any of the three of you in any of the conversations with any of the participants that brought about your contributions, was it ever discussed with you in any way that any of your monies, if not used for the purposes that they said, could be used as a reserve fund in relationship to hostages and Iran?
There was no discussion, as far as I was concerned, ever with the Iranian situation.
No, I never understood anything like that.
Nor me.
Mr. Coors, you and Mr. O'Boyle gave specific contributions for the purchase of malls.
Correct.
You were told it was $65,000 for each mall.
Yes.
Did you ever check to see whether or not there was a markup on that price or not?
That was the price that was listed on the mall catalog.
Now, according to testimony that we have had here, there are 8 airplanes that are involved in a airlift, air service to the Contras in the Central American region. 4 of those are malls. supposedly, from what you told, you would assume that 3 of those malls came from you. But if there was testimony that in the diversion of profits from the arms sales to Iran, that's money were purchased for those planes, then either it had been misrepresented or the money has been applied in some other manner. I want to ask you this, did any way in all in this, did you give any directions that any of your monies, if it was not used for the purchase of malls, could be used as a reserve fund in the future pertaining to the release of hostages in which Iranians would be involved?
Senator, I made a very specific request, and I was told it was followed that the monies that I gave were going to be used to purchase a mall. I subsequently have seen a picture of that plane, and it was indicated to me that that was bought with my funds. The question of Iran wasn't even in existence at the time that I made that contribution. There was no Iranian situation or hostage situation at that time.
Well, I'm just trying to compare testimonies as to how monies came for the malls and a reserve, and whether money is being directed to right sources, and that's the purpose of my inquiry.
Well, if the funds went into the Lake Resource account, I suppose they could have done anything they wanted with it. But this was not in accordance with the instructions that I gave, certainly, and not in accordance with my wishes.
Were you shown, Mr. O'Boyle, any pictures of the malls that you purchased?
No, I wasn't. No, sir.
That's all.
Senator Tribble?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Boyle, you testified in your deposition, and again here today, I believe, that Colonel North showed you photos that appear to be Nicaraguan governmental officials involved in drug operations. Is that correct?
Yes.
What precisely did Colonel North tell you about these pictures?
Well, he showed me the pictures, and there were pictures taken, as I recall, at an airport, and it showed one of the, I think it was one of the cabinet-level ministers of the Nicaraguan government involved in a dope smuggling operation.
Did Mr. North indicate to you where he had obtained those photos?
No.
Did he at any time indicate the photos had been obtained as a part of a DEA investigation or operation? Drug Enforcement Administration?
No.
Did he at any time indicate the photos had been given to him by the CIA?
No.
You can remember nothing else then about that conversation, those photos?
Those particular drug photos? No.
Scarwood, a final question. This is what lawyers might style a friendly question. I am struck by your incredible generosity to good causes, and that of Mr. Coors and Mr. O'Boyle. I wondered if you might provide your correct address and telephone number to all the members of the committee before you leave. No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Mitchell?
Mr. O'Boyle, following your meeting with Colonel North and his description of the secret plan, did you understand that to be a plan of the United States government?
Yes.
And did you understand it to have been a plan that had already been approved or adopted in some form? When he said, "We have a plan"?
Yeah. I didn't know exactly how the plan was to be implemented or whether it had been approved or not.
You understood it to be a plan of the United States government, but you did not know whether or not it had already been approved and was then merely to be placed into execution, or it was a plan to be considered by the government at some future time?
Yes.
Who did you understand Colonel North to be referring to when he said to you, "We have a plan"?
Well, he was a member of the National Security Council,
yes,
a member of the executive branch. If he said, "This is the plan," I assumed that he meant this was the executive plan.
This is a plan of the President and the administration which Mr. North was serving. Would it be a fair inference to conclude that?
It would be an inference, but that's what I concluded.
It is. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Boyle. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No further questions.
Senator McClure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll not take very long, but I do want to echo the comments were made by friend Senator Hatch and others. Coors are friends of mine and have been for many years. We've been political allies in many a political struggle, and God willing, we'll be political allies in future struggles as well. I'm not acquainted with the other witnesses, but I do appreciate the willingness of all three to be involved as good American citizens ought to be in the affairs of their government in a political sense and in the affairs of their government with respect to other occurrences that may bear upon the future security of the United States. And I share with you the conviction that indeed the Soviet penetration of Central America is a very grave danger to this country. Now, I don't mean to make a political speech here, but there's been some aspersions cast at some points that perhaps those of you who are concerned about that are somehow zealots of some kind. Now, Soviet penetration of this hemisphere was not a danger. There's no reason for Congress to have taken the several actions that it has taken with respect to several resolutions with respect to Cuba, as an example. There would be no reason for the late Senator Church, my senior colleague from Idaho, to have, on the eve of his re-election campaign in 1980, to have breached the security rules of the United States, perhaps, but to have revealed that there was a Red Brigade in Cuba. Certainly a very not veiled reference to the dangers that would have to the United States and the implications it would have for our policies. So I think those of you who are really concerned about Soviet expansion throughout the world and their expansion within our hemisphere are far from being subject to condemnation. You ought to be commended, and I do. I think perhaps Congressman Stokes' questions with respect to the secret plan have laid to rest whatever innuendo may have been circulating around this room with respect to that prior to the questions by Congressman Stokes. But I've got a lot of secrets. Some I've even shared with my wife, and they're still secrets. I have a lot of secrets. I've shared some with my campaign workers, my campaign organization, and to the best of my knowledge, they're still secrets within that circle. There are lots of different kinds of secrets we all have, and to say somehow to raise the inference that somehow there was something wrong with having been told a secret certainly flies in the face of human experience. And I would also like to express, because another expression has been made today, that I don't regard it as necessarily a criminal violation or a violation of the Boland Amendment for members of the executive branch to have shared information with people who might be similarly motivated by a concern about what's happening in Nicaragua. And I don't want for myself to have it inferred on the basis of this panel that somehow, because Colonel North may have shared information with people who were then approached by Mr. Channel for contributions, that necessarily means that Colonel North has violated a law. That is for a different forum, at a different time, under different circumstances, to make that determination. This panel is not a criminal prosecutor or a defender. And I make these remarks only from the standpoint that I think it's important that we remember what the mission of this panel is. I suggested
kind of quietly a moment ago, after some of the questions were asked, I suspect members of this panel will be indicted for fishing without a license. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chairman Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions. I do want to thank Mrs. Garwood and Mr. O'Boyle and Mr. Coors for their appearance today. We've appreciated it very much.
I wish to join my co-chairman in thanking all of you for voluntarily participating in this investigation. Thank you very much. The panel will stand in recess until 2:30 this afternoon, at which time General Singlaub will be the witness. The Joint Committee will please come to order. We will resume the testimony of General Singlaub. May I call upon Mr. Van Cleve.
General, good afternoon. I have only a few brief questions this afternoon. There are just a couple of topic areas that I'd like to cover with you. I'd like to start by talking with you about the fundraising efforts that you engaged in 1984 and 1985 in connection with countries 3 and 5. That general
84, 85.
Right.
Yeah.
You testified yesterday that you met with the Washington representatives of these countries in late November or early December 1984. The first question I wanted to ask you is whether or not Oliver North had asked you to approach these countries prior to those contacts with their Washington representatives.
No, because I was good friends with those head of delegation here. I suggested that that might be a lucrative source of funds. We had discussed the problem of getting funding, and he thought that that was a good idea since I had such good relations with those people. So I did, in fact, make that with his knowledge, but he had not asked me to do it.
I see. Okay. You informed him, in effect, that you were
That's
going
correct.
to do this. Okay. And in making these contacts, you were acting as a private citizen, weren't you?
I was, and I made that very clear in the first sentence I uttered when I got in the presence of those individuals.
Okay. And in that connection, I'd like to ask you to refer to what has been previously marked as JKS Exhibit 8. It should be the last, the last but one. I think they've added a new exhibit to your book. Now, this is a memorandum dated December 4, 1984 from Oliver L. North to Robert McFarland, if you have the same exhibit that I do. Is that correct? Okay. If you look at page 2 of this document, General, you'll see that it begins, later that afternoon, M. Jack Singlaub visited to advise of 2 meetings he had held early in the day regarding support for the resistance. Singlaub passed on the following points, and then you can see that there's an account of 2 meetings.
Right.
And for security reasons, some of the identities have been deleted, but what I'd like to do is to ask you if you'd look at particularly the 3rd paragraph of the first of these 2 accounts of meetings, and just review that, and then tell me, I have a couple of questions about it.
Yes, I've read it.
Okay. This paragraph says, the USG is unaware of the Singlaub mission, and he is making this request based on his long friendship, and then I assume it follows some individuals' names. Because of the law restricting USG involvement, no USG official can solicit on behalf of the resistance forces. Now, what I wanted to ask you, General, is was that your account to Oliver North of what you told the official from Country 3?
Yes.
That's an accurate account?
It is.
Thank you. Now, when you met on or about December 4th with Oliver North to tell him about these meetings, and he said, according to your testimony yesterday, that he saw no objections to the course of action that you were suggesting, I take it that what he meant was that it was consistent with the President's policy, and that because you were a private citizen, you were free to do this in any event. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you. Turning now to the trips that you made in early January of 1985. When you approached officials of Country 3 in early 1985, they were concerned, as I understand it, about whether making a contribution to the Contras was consistent with United States government policy. Is that correct?
That's one of their concerns, right.
Okay. Would it be fair to say it was a major concern of theirs?
Yes.
Okay. And to reassure the officials of Country 3 on this point, you told them that you thought you could arrange to have a signal sent. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Did you have any basis at that time for your belief that a signal could be sent to Country 3 other than your view that administration policy generally favored the Contras?
No, I didn't think of it in advance, but when I got there, I realized that they were going to have to take my presentation on faith and the fact that they'd known me for a long time. But I realized that the ones that I was dealing with were not necessarily the final decision maker in that country, and that perhaps they would want to have some assurance that I was not an unguided missile ricocheting around through that part of the world. So I wanted to give them assurance that I would try to arrange, and I made it tentative, for someone who they would know is in the position to know what the President's policy is, to give a signal that they knew about my visit and understood my motives and had no objection to it.
Okay. I want to be clear on that, on exactly what you believe the nature of the signal that was to be sent was. If I understood you correctly, what you've just testified is that the signal would be to the effect that the government was aware that you would approach these other countries, that that your approach was consistent with the President's position, which was to support the Contras, and that the administration had no objection. But in other words, there was no affirmative representation that you represented the government, for example. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I knew that I could not get them to go and do the soliciting themselves.
In fact, you had already told these countries as much when you met with their D.C. representatives. Isn't that correct?
Precisely.
Okay. So that, as you put it, the purpose of the signal was simply to represent to these countries that you were not an unguided missile.
Right.
Thank you. You testified yesterday that you had had conversations about this question of a signal with Oliver North when you returned from Country 3 and Country 5 in early 1985. I understood your testimony to be that you really didn't know what had happened after that point with respect to the efforts in connection with those two countries. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So you don't know whether a signal was ever sent to this day, do you?
I don't know for first-hand knowledge. That's correct.
Okay. Did you ever have conversations, other than conversations with Oliver North and Elliott Abrams, I believe you testified to yesterday, about fundraising in connection with foreign governments? Do you ever have those conversations with any other United States government official?
I don't believe that I did have. It is possible that there were others present in the office with Elliott Abrams, his deputy.
And who was that?
That was Bill Walker.
Bill Walker. Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that I had conversations with anyone else.
Okay. So that the record is clear, was your conversation with Elliott Abrams to the same effect with respect to the nature of the signal that would be sent, as you previously have testified to in connection with your earlier activities concerning countries 3 and 5?
Well, on my first visit in January of '85, I had not made any prearrangements for a signal. In 1986, when I was planning another trip out there, and since I believed that no funding had been sent, I thought that the first meetings probably had aborted because a signal was not sent. I wanted to have the nature of the signal or the individual who would send that established before I made the trip in 1986.
Okay.
That is why I went to Elliott and asked for his help in that.
I understand, and I think my question may not have been clear because you testified to that effect yesterday. My question was as to the nature of the signal itself. And again, without being too colloquial about it, was it to represent to these other governments that this is not an unguided missile?
Right, exactly.
Thank
and
you.
It was the same type of thing.
I'd like to turn now to another subject, if I might. Could you describe for the committee, please, in general terms, the nature of your business arrangements with Geomilitech? When they began, what position you held, and as I say, in general terms, the nature of your compensation arrangement and so on.
I was asked by the president of Geomilitech if I would serve as an unpaid military consultant. I agreed to do this. I had known the president of Geomilitech through a radio program that she had hosted in Miami. It was a very conservative, pro-freedom fighter program, and when she moved to Washington to take up this new, establish this new company, she asked if I would be a military consultant. I agreed to do that. I never received any compensation, however, for any of that.
And did Geomilitech normally sell weapons of the type that would be used or might be used by the Contras?
Did they sell them before?
Did they normally sell weapons of the type that might be used by the Contras?
No, this was the first effort that they made, that they had the contacts that I was able to use in terms of putting together the total package.
I see. Did Geomilitech receive any profits on the Contra arms deal that you arranged?
No, I regret that they didn't receive any profits at all. I believe that they actually lost money because trips were taken on behalf of my efforts to help negotiate this total package, and Geomilitech absorbed those costs.
Okay. And just so the record is clear, did you personally receive any profits in connection with that arms transaction?
None whatsoever.
Thank you. Just one final subject, if I might. You have previously testified that you were connected with fundraising on behalf of the Contras, and that you were involved in weapons purchases on behalf of the Contras. Were you involved in training the Contra forces themselves? Have you been involved in that in the past?
I have not personally, except in the way of giving advice and discussing strategy, tactics with Enrique Bermudez and some of his comandantes, but I did arrange to bring some retired military people who volunteered to do this without compensation, just for their expenses, trip down and payment of their food and place to stay while they were down there.
And have you been engaged within the last several years in the giving of general military advice to the Contras, would you say?
Yes, I would say that in terms of discussing tactics, strategy with a friend, I was never referred to as an advisor. I was referred to as a friend, but I think that we learn from our friends who have had similar experiences.
Okay. To your knowledge, has Colonel North been engaged in providing general military advice to the Contras, say during the period late 1984 to late 1986?
Well, I'm afraid I don't have any first-hand knowledge of that.
I see. You wouldn't have any first-hand knowledge. Have you been engaged in giving specific military advice on particular operations to the Contra forces?
I think that they have reviewed planned operations with me in my presence, discussed it, and asked if I had any thoughts on it.
Yes. As to specific operations?
As to a specific operation.
Okay. And to your knowledge, did Colonel North, during the period late 1984 to late 1986, provide specific military advice on particular military operations to the Contras, if you know?
I'm afraid I don't have any first knowledge of that.
I see. So is it
firsthand
fair to
knowledge.
conclude then from your testimony that although you yourself are really fairly familiar with the military forces of the Contras and have been engaged in giving both general and specific military advice and so on, that to your knowledge, Colonel North has not been engaged in providing either specific or general military advice during that period?
Well, I just can't...
Based on your knowledge.
I can't give you any other information than the fact that I don't know, because we never traveled to Central America together.
I see. Okay. Do you think that there's some... I think I have no further questions of this witness, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General.
The chair recognizes.
Mr. Chairman, could I just make a point about General Singlob's travel plans next week? And he wanted first to, and we both want to thank you for putting him on yesterday at some possible inconvenience to other witnesses in order to accommodate his schedule. And we appreciate coming back again today in order to, and what we would hope is, in view of he has travel plans next week, that he could finish his testimony today, possibly this evening, in order to be able to begin his travel plans that are scheduled for next week.
I'm pleased to advise you that we will complete our interrogation today.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes Representative Contra for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, I would just like to pursue for a moment the relationship you had with Oliver North, because I think it does go to the heart of some of the committee's inquiry here. You went to countries 3 and 5 in January of 1985, and your testimony is that you, in essence, were not an agent of Colonel North.
That is correct.
He did not tell you who to say, and don't, I want this to be your testimony and not mine. He did not tell you who to say, and he did not ask you or tell you what to say to these individuals or to which individuals you were supposed to see.
That is correct. He did not know the individuals that I was planning to see.
And this was something that you thought would be a good idea. It was not his idea.
That is correct.
How about with respect to other individuals in the government of the United States? Same question I have with regard to either the President, the Vice President, Admiral Poindexter, or Bud McFarland. Did any one of those individuals ask you, order you, tell you to go in January to countries 3 and 5 to see certain individuals or to say certain things to those individuals?
No.
Any other government official?
No.
In 1986, you went again to those 2 countries. The questions I have generally are the same. Did any government official, including those that I just aforementioned, a few moments ago mentioned, tell you who to see or what to say?
No, it was purely my idea. I was going back again. I assumed that my first effort had aborted.
In 1985, your prior testimony indicated that you did not speak with Mr. Casey.
That's correct.
In 1986, you indicated that you spoke with him a number of times. Is that not correct?
I think there's a misunderstanding here. I did speak to Mr. Casey in 1985 and 1986, but never on the subject of Nicaragua.
What specifically would be said by him if you brought up Central America or Nicaragua?
He would say, "Jack, I'll throw you out of my office." He used an expletive that I have not used, indicating that he did not want me to raise that subject with him because he clearly was an intelligence officer and probably covered by the Bolin Amendment.
You took his statement as one that was being quite sincere.
I did, yes.
With respect to your contact with Elliot Abrams of the State Department, you indicated just a few moments ago that you had met with him. Was it ever alone, or was there always Foreign Service officers present?
I cannot remember ever meeting with him alone. Usually he had his deputy or perhaps one other with him.
Did Elliot Abrams ever ask you to stay in touch with those Foreign Service officers that were?
Yes, he did.
Did Mr. Abrams ever discourage you from making contacts with foreign governments?
No.
Did Mr. Abrams ever suggest to you that you should go to foreign countries and solicit funds?
No, he did not.
He did not, therefore, similar to the other statements or questions, did not ask you to go to countries 3 or 5 or tell you who you were supposed to see there or tell you what you were supposed to ask them.
That's correct.
You didn't make, General, much money by your help in Central America, did you?
Make any money? No, I did
That's
not
not
make
much. Why did you do it?
Well, I tried to explain that in my opening statement, that I believe in the cause. I have devoted my life to trying to advance the cause of freedom. I just feel that I still have some energy left. I have some experience that might be useful in this fight. I believe it's in the interest of this country to get as many people working with the freedom fighters as possible. So I've decided to do that.
In 1984, the record is pretty obvious. I think it was December 1984, the Boland Amendment was passed. There was a prohibition of United States military aid to the Contras. What was the effect of that cutoff of aid to the democratic resistance in Central America? And while you answer that question very quickly, if you would, were there plans that the Contras had that had to be canceled because of the termination of the prospects for aid?
Actually, the Boland Amendment, and there were really several Boland amendments, but the one that had the greatest impact went into effect before December of 1984. For all intents and purposes, the supplies that had been purchased were consumed by early fall of 1984. Yes, there were plans that could not be executed because they did not have enough money to buy food, to buy replacement clothing, boots, and it's a very pathetic thing to see these brave young men, many of them wounded, staggering into their base camps with shredded uniforms, boots that are falling off of them, and out of ammunition. And that was their condition.
There also, if I might ask, with respect to the Boland Amendment and particularly Soviet involvement with regard to supplies to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. There came a time, did there not, that the Soviet Union shipped Hind helicopters to Central America, Nicaragua?
That is about the same time that our Congress cut off all aid to those freedom fighters.
Hind helicopters are pretty sophisticated fighting machines, would you not say?
I have described it as the most effective people-killing machine in the world.
They're fairly expensive to the Soviet Union, I would imagine.
Quite.
I would imagine the Soviet Union, because of their sophistication, because of their cost, would not want to lose many of them either in battle or to the United States or to some other side that may be able to reverse engineer them. Is that a fair statement?
That's a true statement.
Did you ever have any conversations, or in your opinion, as a military leader with vast experience, would you conclude that it may very well have been the fact that the United States was at a time incapable of giving sophisticated defenses against that type of a weapon? In other words, we couldn't have any surface-to-air missiles, no blowpipes, no shoulder-fired stingers. Because of that, do you think that the Hind helicopters were sent to Nicaragua because they could be used and they would not be threatened, i.e. they would not be lost, they would be safe? Is that reasonable?
It is reasonable, quite.
We heard other people mention the fact that the Soviet bloc countries had given from 1983 to 86 about over $3 billion of aid to the Sandinista government. The United States aid during the time it was permitted was significantly less than that. The results of those $3 billion of aid to the Sandinista government, did that create an efficient fighting force in Central America?
Well, it is certainly the largest and the best equipped force in Central America. In view of the defections from that force, I would say that it's probably not the most efficient force, but by the size of both the number of men and the equipment they have, it is the most powerful force south of the Rio Grande.
How does it compare, for example, to Costa Rica, the military fighting capability of Costa Rica?
Costa Rica has no military fighting capability. They have no armed forces at all. They have a small police force only.
Is the military force of the Sandinistas primarily defensive, offensive, or would it be a mix?
Looking at the sophistication of the weapon systems and the weapons in the other countries, it appears to be clearly an offensive force. The number of tanks they have, the number of armored personnel carriers, the number of artillery weapons indicate that it is an offensive military force.
There's been great deals said about Soviet bloc aid to Central America, to the Sandinistas, since the revolution in 1979. From your experience in talking with people living in that part of the world, do you know whether the Soviet bloc gave training, gave aid, gave logistics, gave information and materiel to the Sandinistas, in fact, before they seized power in 1979?
I believe that they did this through their surrogate, Cuba. That was an open knowledge in the area that the Sandinista forces would go to Havana, receive training. There were Cubans in the force. There were Panamanians, by the way, who assisted in that period. Today, there are roughly 11,000 foreign military forces, military and civilian advisors, all from communist countries and from terrorist organizations in Nicaragua.
General Singalab, you're an expert, I would imagine, if anybody is, in evaluating and assisting freedom-fighting insurgencies in different parts of the world. You're familiar with Jonas Savimbi, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, what is going on in Cambodia and the resistance there. How do the Contras, the democratic resistance in Central America and Nicaragua, stack up to other types of resistance movements in the area of human rights, in morale and dedication, in corruption, those types of areas, very quickly?
Well, I believe that they not only are better motivated, they have geography on their side, which is not true of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan or of the Cambodians or the Vietnamese in Southeast Asia. They also have a better record of human rights, lack of human rights violations. They have a code of conduct that I've not found in any of the other armed forces. That's a nicety that comes later in most guerrilla organizations.
General Singalab, thank you very much. My time is running out quickly. You know that the Congress is very happy to give aid to some democratic resistance movements, not in Central America. We can't mention the names. I would ask you the following question. By our termination of military aid to the Contras in Central America, will that affect the capabilities, the motivation, the desire, the will of those democratic resistance organizations in different parts of the world in which the United States has an interest in helping, and of course we are helping them?
Certainly, of course it does. If we are not interested enough to take care of this force that is on our borders for all intents and purposes, within walking distance of our borders, how can we possibly be a reliable ally on the other side of the world? It has had an adverse impact. It's dumbfounding, I would say, to the leaders of the democratic resistance movements in Africa and in Asia.
It's dumbfounding because we seem to be more inclined to help those resistance movements over 5,000 miles away and disinclined to help those resistance movements that are closer to our own capital than is, for example, California.
That's correct. It's irrational and immoral, in my view.
There's been a lot said about the fact that Nicaragua can never be a threat to the United States, regardless of what happens there. And my last question, General, is what is the strategic consequences to the United States if a communist totalitarian regime in Nicaragua is consolidated and with the offensive fighting force you mentioned has that freedom and has that capability?
Well, not only is the military force being created there a threat well recognized by Nicaragua's neighbors, but the bases that are being built there, both naval and air bases, are a direct threat to the United States. As Adolfo Calero mentioned yesterday, the Punta Huete big air base there is the largest air base south of the Rio Grande. It would enable the Soviets to base long-range bombers and reconnaissance aircraft there that would be a direct threat to our security. The bases that are being built on the Pacific coast would give them, for the first time, a base from which they could threaten the west coast of the United States. The obvious place for a second canal, ocean-to-ocean canal through the isthmus, is through Nicaragua. I would not want to have a canal, a second canal, in the hands of the Soviets, which it would be if we allow the Sandinistas to consolidate this communist revolution there.
I thank you, General, and I thank the Chair.
Thank you very much. I yield myself 15 minutes. General, in early 1985, if my recollection is correct, you testified that you proposed that the United States government sell arms to an intermediary vendor, and that this vendor mark up the price to country 3, and that this difference between the cost and the retail price be diverted to the Contras. Is my recollection correct?
That is not quite correct, Senator Inouye. That I had mentioned as one of 3 options when I spoke to the leadership in Country 3 that I could approach if they would identify a vendor from whom they were going to buy some significant quantities of materiel, and perhaps arrange for them to split the commission. I had no specific item in mind at that time, but I had been approached by some of these same friends in that government with a request that I try to find them vendors who could sell them aircraft comparable to the F-20 that they were interested in. They were deeply concerned about their lack of anti-submarine capability. I knew that they were going to be working through vendors. I believed that the majority of the people in this country are sympathetic to the Nicaraguan freedom fighters and to President Reagan's policy of providing them with support.
Did you discuss this proposal with Colonel North?
No, I did not as a specific proposal as you're making. I did brief him that this was one of 3 options that I had proposed to Country 3.
Did he approve this, one of these 3?
I was not taking things to Colonel North for approval. At that time, I was merely briefing him on what had taken place and requesting that he pick up the ball and carry it from then on with respect to sending a signal, and that I was available for any additional meetings or efforts to solicit.
Isn't the concept very similar to the one that was employed in the Iran arms sale?
There have been several media representatives who have speculated that there is a similarity, yes.
In your opening statement, you suggested that if you had known beforehand the intent of the officials of the government of the United States to deal in arms with Iran, but unfortunately you did not know. If you knew, what would you have done?
As I've indicated, I am working with freedom fighters who oppose totalitarianism around the world. I have been in contact with the resistance inside Iran, and those members that I am dealing with are absolutely opposed to the individuals that Oliver North and others were dealing with. I suspect that if I had known at the time that they were dealing with these people who are recognized as something less than completely reliable, I might have made some efforts to inform appropriate people in our government of my knowledge of that situation. The current resistance, the Iranian National Army, is opposed not only to the communists' efforts there today, opposed also to the current government with which Dick Secord and others were in direct contact.
Yesterday you testified that you discussed with Colonel North your special role as, I believe you said, lightning rod for public and press attention in regard to the private funding of Contras, to take away attention from the covert activities of General Secord and Colonel North. Whose attention were you trying to distract?
Well, as I indicated, this was an unwitting benefit of my efforts to raise money. I discussed this, that if the media was tracking me, following me from one of my speeches or fundraising activities to another, they could not be following Colonel North. And if I did not have any contact with Colonel North or General Secord, whom I knew was involved in some of the more covert parts of this action, they would not be tracking them. And I pointed this out as one of the benefits that accrued to my relatively high profile, others being the fact that there was someone who was an old retired soldier who was speaking out in defense of the Contras at a time when everybody was saying how bad they were. That was a boost to their morale, and of course you can't raise funds without going public, and so that was the third benefit from
So one of the benefits that you pointed out was to divert attention away from the Congress.
No, divert the attention of the Congress and the media away from the covert
Now,
activities undergoing.
If I recall, there were stories about your successful fundraising. In fact, one article said that you raised tens of millions of dollars. Did you attempt to correct that?
Yes, I did. I have attempted to correct many of the items that appear in the press. The problem with our modern technology is that once a lie is put into the computer, anybody else can pull it up, and they do, and if it suits their purpose, they print that. My denials and efforts to correct the record don't seem to get filed for some reason.
According to the files we have, and I think this might be a good time to correct the record, in 1985, you raised $279,612, and 1986, $259 and $173. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's the dollars raised for the specific purpose of the Nicaraguan freedom fighters.
Yesterday, you testified that when you solicited Country 3, you were informed that a signal would have to be sent by the the administration, the United States government, that you were acting with their support. And subsequently, you testified that in May of 1986, Assistant Secretary Abrams informed you that he would be able to provide this so-called signal. Is that correct, sir?
That's essentially correct, yes, sir.
And would you say that Secretary Abrams' willingness to provide this signal helped you in your solicitation?
Well, no, because after I had arrived in Country 3 and had made my appointments to see the head of state, I had a telephone call from Mr. Abrams who said, do not carry out your extracurricular activities there that we discussed. And I said, well, I've already made the contact. And he said, well, I know that, but don't carry through with it. I'll explain when you get back why.
Are you aware that Assistant Secretary Abrams previously told the Tower Commission that he did not offer to provide this signal because he felt that it was not right, and that has denied participating in any effort to support the Contra?
I did not know that until I read it in, I think, the New York Times or one of the papers that I read this morning.
Did that surprise you?
It did, yes.
And my final question is, did you ever obtain false U.S. passports in connection with your activities in support of the Contras?
No, absolutely not.
Chair recognizes Senator Rudman for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think I'll need the 15 minutes. General Singlab, your life's history reads almost like fiction, but it's true. You have a very distinguished career. I think that somewhere in the record ought to show that during your service to this country, to mention only a few, I believe you're the holder of the Distinguished Service Medal, am I correct?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And you hold awards for valor. You hold the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Soldier's Medal, and the Purple Heart.
That's correct.
And you're a very refreshing witness because you make no secret about what you've done or why you've done it. And frankly, I only intend to ask you a few questions that might either confirm or rebut some things we've heard from other witnesses, because I expect that we will get a straight answer from you. The first thing I would like to do is just clear one thing up for the record. There were two exhibits, JKS-5 and JKS-6. I think you're familiar with those two exhibits.
I see 5 and 6, yes.
Just so the record is straight, those proposals, I will call them, 5 and 6, neither were solicited by anyone in the United States government. Am I correct?
That is correct, sir.
They were, in fact, JKS-6 was not even your idea. It was the idea of an associate of yours.
That is correct.
On both occasions, you forwarded those proposals to someone in the government, I think Mr. Casey, on what, both occasions?
No, the first one was a letter that I did send to Bill Casey. The second one was sent or hand-carried by an associate to Bill Casey.
But they both went to Mr. Casey.
That is correct, yes.
But he certainly didn't solicit them, and neither proposal was adopted.
That is correct.
Yeah. I find it interesting that, and I will not review it here so not to be repetitive, but following the chairman's question about the genesis of the idea of a diversion to fund the Contras, if one wants to read JKS-6 very closely, that is truly a scheme for diversion. Am I correct?
That's correct.
I mean, that is absolutely a mirror image of what happened, except with different players and different names.
That's correct.
Thank you. I want to turn to the spring of '85 very briefly and just talk a bit about weapons. You sold some weapons to the Contras in the spring, summer of '85, and you received $5.3 million for that purchase. That's what it cost the Contras, 5.3.
That's right. The Contras paid that for the weapons that they received
Correct.
from the weapons dealer.
Yes. And in fact, you paid the supplier 4.8. You had to pay $300,000 for transportation, and you had $200,000 left, so you gave that over in the form of humanitarian aid.
There was also some other costs in there for insurance and such things. I think that at the end there was about $100,000 left, and as Adolfo Calero needed it, he would ask that that money be transferred to a variety of humanitarian aid vendors.
And you transferred every bit of it.
That's correct.
As a matter of fact, if you look at your life's history, money has never been an incentive for you. Am I correct, General Singlab?
I'm criticized regularly for that, yes.
I'm sure. So you sold these to them in the spring of '85, and at that time you found out that General Secord's prices on the identical weapons were nearly twice yours. Am I correct?
That is correct.
And you had some discussions about this with some people.
I did.
And in fact, you reported the fact that these weapons, which they were buying through energy resources, were costing them twice as much as yours were, and you reported that to Colonel North.
I did, yes.
And he agreed, when looking at what you showed him for documentation, that your prices were enormously better than General Secord's.
That's correct.
As a matter of fact, the Contras, if you could have kept supplying it at that price, would have received 2 weapons for every one that they received under General Secord's prices. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, after you pointed that out to Colonel North, what was his reaction? Did he encourage you to go back and do some more business with the Contras?
Well, his first reaction was that when we get some more money, perhaps we can pursue the same source. That never happened, however. I believe that in the course of our discussions, there appeared to be other factors that had a bearing on the decision as to the source of weapons procurement.
The other factors are obviously referring to is the fact that General Secord was involved in another endeavor, namely the Iran arms transfer, which you did not know at that time. Am I correct?
I don't know for sure, but the facts are that I did not know about that, and that might very well have been the other problem.
But in any event, after you indicated to the man in our government who, right or wrong, and we can't determine that, somebody else will determine that, whether right or wrong, was trying to do what he could to help the Contras, and showed him that you could get them a very good price on these weapons. In fact, nothing happened. You didn't get any orders after that at all. You had the one order, and that was it.
That's correct.
In fact, you were just cut out of the deal.
That is also correct.
And as a matter of fact, since this whole story has broken, you have found out that General Secord was in a very unique position. General Secord was the recipient, either in trust or otherwise, of a huge amount of money that represented a markup on U.S. goods. Is that correct? You learned that like we all did.
That's right. Yes, sir.
And he was also in the position of controlling those monies to buy what the Contras might want from him.
I've learned that, yes.
You've learned that. And during that period that money was being held, the Contras needed a lot of things. Did they not, General Singlab?
I must say that that is a source of great irritation to me, that I was working very hard during that time to get a few $100,000. If I had any knowledge that that money had been in a bank and was available, I would be even more furious.
And in fact, there were millions of dollars in accounts, and we have had testimony under oath to this committee that money was being held for the enterprise. That is General Secord's testimony. Certainly, you could have done a lot with that $8 million to help the Contra cause. Could you have not?
That's correct. The Contras could have used it.
General, do you have a Swiss bank account?
No.
You never had a Swiss bank account?
Never.
I'll ask you a question which you may not wish to answer, and I will not press you on it, but I will simply ask it, and you don't seem to be one who is hesitant to express a view, so if you feel like expressing one, I'll give you that opportunity. Do you think that, in light of what you heard in terms of the mall airplanes and who claims they own them, and all of the other aircraft and who own those aircraft, and money in Swiss bank accounts, and doubling the price of arms, do you think General Secord and his associates treated the Contras as someone they really wanted to help, or somebody they wished to profit by?
You're right. I would prefer not to answer that.
You've answered it. Thank you.
Congressman Foley, 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Sinlob, I'd like to join with Senator Rudman and others on this committee in recognizing your long and distinguished active duty career in the U.S. Army.
Thank you, sir.
As one of the most decorated and dedicated officers, and one with a brilliant combat record, you have our universal respect.
Thank you, sir.
I want to take you back to the meeting you had in January of 1985 with Colonel Oliver North, when you described to him your plans to visit Country 3 and 5.
Right.
And you told him you would undertake to solicit funds or support for military assistance to the democratic resistance.
That's correct.
And he approved that and gave us his blessing, did he not?
He concurred in my doing that. Generally speaking, we had an arrangement that silence was approval if he did not want to indicate approval for some legalistic reason. In this case, if I went away feeling
you knew that if he didn't object to it, it meant his approval.
That's correct.
And he did not object.
He did not object to it.
And he, in fact, asked you to report back to him on your success, did he not?
He did.
And when you visited countries 3 and 5, you visited top officials of that government who were previously in your acquaintance.
That's correct.
And you told Colonel North you were going to do that.
I did.
And he did not object.
He did not object.
These officials of country 3 and 5 knew you as an important American Army officer who had commanded our forces in Korea.
Actually, I was not the commander in Korea. I was the chief of staff for the United Nations.
Chief of staff in Korea.
Right.
But they knew you had that.
That's
rank.
correct.
And so there was reason to believe that you might be speaking with the concurrence of the U.S. interests, but there was not absolute sureness about that, so you thought that perhaps they needed a signal that you were acting with the approval of the U.S. government.
At least with the knowledge of the U.S. government, yes.
In fact, there wasn't any great reason for these countries to make this contribution unless they thought it was with the approval of the U.S. government, was there?
No, they also had the concern that they did not want it to be made public because it might create some problems with the Congress, whom they relied upon for support. They did not want to openly defy the will of the Congress as expressed in the Boland Amendment.
So the only way that they would be willing to do this is if they thought that their confidence would be respected, that they would not be seen as opposing the will of Congress, and that they would in fact have the approval of the U.S. executive branch.
That's correct, sir.
And they would have no reason at all to do it if they didn't feel that it had the approval of the executive branch.
That's correct.
So when you talk to them about a signal of approval from the U.S. executive branch, that signal was a rather important, if not essential, maybe an essential part, perhaps, of a successful solicitation. Is that correct?
I believe that it was, yes.
And without such a signal, they could not be expected to agree to the solicitation.
They might have, but I concluded that they probably would not if they did not.
Let me put it this way. If they did not feel that there was evidence that the U.S. executive branch wished them to make this contribution, is it your opinion that they would not have made the contribution?
That's correct, yes, sir.
So I would, rephrasing the question, the knowledge of the approval.
Since I had such good relations with those people, so I did, in fact, make that with his knowledge, but he had not asked me to do it.
I see. Okay. You informed him, in effect, that you were going to do this. Okay. And in making these contacts, you were acting as a private citizen, weren't you?
I was, and I made that very clear in the first sentence I uttered when I got in the presence of those individuals.
Okay, and in that connection, I'd like to ask you to refer to